I rented the cabin at Stillwater Ridge because I needed quiet. My mind had been running too fast for months, and I thought a few days alone in the mountains would help me slow down. The photos online showed a small wooden place surrounded by tall pine trees, a few miles off a dirt road that twisted through a forest. The idea of sitting by a fire, hearing only the wind and birds, sounded like something I needed badly. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky covered with thin gray clouds that looked like they could turn to rain. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, but solidly built. The logs were dark from years of weather, the porch had a creaking step, and the air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. There was an old shed to the right, its door hanging unevenly on one hinge. Behind the cabin, the woods sloped steeply downward into a valley. The silence felt heavy. I carried my bags inside. The interior was simple. One main room with a couch, a small kitchen, a short hallway leading to a bedroom, and a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. The floors were wooden and rough. There was a faint smell of smoke that seemed to have soaked into the walls over years of fires. A small window over the sink looked out toward the woods. The first few hours felt peaceful. I unpacked, checked that I had phone service, only one bar, but it was something, and lit a small fire in the wood stove. The fire crackled softly. I sat near it with a blanket over my knees, reading a book, occasionally looking out the window at the stillness outside. By the time night came, the forest had gone dark in a way city darkness never is. I turned off the lamp and stood near the window for a while. The only light came from the faint orange of the fire reflecting off the glass. The trees outside looked like solid black walls. The silence was so complete that even the sound of the firewood shifting inside the stove made me jump a little. I went to bed early. The bed was stiff. The sheets smelled faintly of dust. I lay there listening to the faint ticking of cooling metal from the stove. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, maybe just a branch moving in the wind, but there was no wind. I listened harder. The sound came again, a small creak from the porch. I told myself it was probably an animal. Raccoons or deer were common in these woods. I turned on my side and tried to sleep again, but I couldn't. The sound came again, this time slower, like the weight of something shifting on the wooden boards outside. Then silence. I lay perfectly still, my heartbeat loud in my ears. After a while, nothing else happened. I eventually drifted off again. Morning light came through the thin curtains. Everything looked normal. The forest outside was calm. I made coffee and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold and smelled like wet soil. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the steps, the thin layer of mud had faint marks in it. Not boot prints exactly, but smudged impressions that didn't look like any animal track I knew. They were faint enough that I couldn't make sense of them. I brushed it off. Maybe they'd been there before I arrived. The day passed quietly. I hiked a short trail near the ridge and took photos of the view from the top. From up there, I could see miles of forest in every direction, endless green fading into blue haze. The dirt road I'd come in on was barely visible, and there were no other houses or cabins anywhere in sight. When I got back, the air had turned colder. I gathered more firewood from the stack behind the shed. The woods behind the cabin felt thicker now, the trees growing closer together as if they'd moved while I was gone. Every now and then I thought I heard something small move in the brush, but I never saw anything. That night, I sat by the stove again, eating from a can of soup and listening to the quiet. The longer I sat, the more I noticed small sounds that I hadn't before. Little clicks, soft thuds, faint crunches in the distance. Could have been anything, but the quiet between those sounds made them seem louder. When I went to bed, I left the lamp on in the main room, cast a faint glow into the hall. For a long time, I lay there listening. Hours passed before I started to drift. Then there was a dull thump against the side of the cabin. I froze. The sound wasn't sharp, more like something heavy brushing against the wall. I held my breath. A few seconds later, another thump came, a little higher up. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for something else. Then there was silence again. Eventually, I got out of bed, moving slowly so the floorboards wouldn't creak. I walked to the window and looked out. The porch was empty. The firewood pile, the steps, everything looked still. I stayed there, staring for several minutes. Nothing moved. I finally went back to bed, though it took a long time to fall asleep. In the morning, I checked the side of the cabin. Near where I thought the sound came from, I found a mark on the wood, a faint streak like something had scraped against it. It wasn't deep, but fresh enough to notice. I ran my fingers over it. Whatever made it wasn't an animal. The height of it was too high off the ground. I started feeling uneasy. The cabin, which had felt peaceful the day before, now felt too quiet. Every time I stepped outside, I caught myself looking into the trees for movement. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be out there. That afternoon, clouds rolled in and the temperature dropped. By evening, rain started falling hard, pounding on the roof in steady waves. I sat inside, the fire burning low, and watched water run down the windows. The power flickered once but stayed on. The rain made everything sound closer. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind pushing against it made me jump. I tried reading, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. Outside was just darkness and the faint reflection of my own face. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it again. A sound on the porch. The rain muffled it, but I could tell something was moving out there. The boards made soft, uneven noises. Slow steps, then a pause, then another. I stayed completely still in the chair, staring at the window. The sound moved toward the door, then nothing, just rain. I waited for maybe a full minute before I forced myself to move. I picked up the flashlight and pointed it toward the front door. I didn't open it, I just listened. There was no movement. I turned the light off and backed away from the door. The sound didn't come again that night, but I didn't sleep at all. By morning, the rain had stopped, but fog covered everything. It rolled through the trees in thick white waves, making it hard to see more than 20 feet ahead. The air felt colder than it should have. I stepped outside carefully. The porch was wet, small puddles gathered in the corners. And there, in the mud below the steps, were fresh footprints. Human ones this time, barefoot. The toes and heels were clear in the soft soil, pointing toward the steps, toward the cabin. I stared at them for a long time, trying to understand. Whoever it was had been out there in the storm. Nos chus. No tracks leading away, just those few prints facing the cabin. The fog was thick enough that I couldn't see where they ended. The idea of being watched in that fog made my stomach feel tight. I went back inside and locked the door. For the rest of that day, I kept the windows closed and tried to distract myself. I cleaned the kitchen, made coffee, checked my phone for service. It had dropped completely. I kept glancing toward the windows, expecting to see movement, but all I saw was fog shifting through the trees. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to make light that could be seen from outside. I sat in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, listening. Every sound of the forest seemed magnified. The soft drip of water, the creak of the roof, the occasional snap of wood in the distance. Somewhere deep in the woods, I thought I heard something that didn't fit. A short metallic clink. It was faint but distinct, like something metal hitting another piece of metal once, then stopping. It came again a few minutes later, then silence. I barely slept that night. When daylight came, the fog began to thin. I decided to leave. I started packing my things quickly, not even finishing breakfast. But when I went outside to load my bag into the car, I saw something that made me stop completely. The shed door, which had been closed, was now wide open. I hadn't been near it since I arrived. The inside was dark, the opening black like a hole. The ground in front of it was muddy and disturbed. I stood there for almost a full minute, afraid to move closer. Eventually, I forced myself to step toward it. Inside the shed, the air smelled old and damp. There were broken tools on a shelf, a stack of rotting firewood, and a rusted metal barrel tipped on its side. In the far corner, the dirt floor looked like it had been disturbed recently. A patch of earth turned over and smoothed back down. There was something about the shape of it that didn't feel right. I stepped closer and crouched down. The dirt had shallow grooves in it, as if something had been dragged through and covered up quickly. A faint odor hung in the air, sharp and sour, different from the smell of rot. A sudden sound from behind made me freeze, the faint crunch of leaves outside the shed. I turned slowly, but saw nothing through the doorway. The fog was gone now, the woods clear and silent. I backed away, left the shed, and shut the door tight. My hands were shaking as I went to the car. I turned the key, but the engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The dashboard lights flickered but didn't catch. The silence after the second attempt felt heavier than before. I looked toward the treeline. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was there. I went back inside the cabin to think. The only option was to wait until morning and walk down the dirt road toward the main highway. It was about 6 miles. I could manage that if I started early. That night, I blocked the door with the table and stayed awake on the couch with the flashlight in my hand. The air inside felt cold and still. Hours passed without any sound except the occasional crack of wood cooling in the stove. Sometime deep in the night, there was a sound at the window. Not a knock, just a faint brushing, like a hand sliding slowly across the glass. Then a pause. Then again, a slow drag from one side to the other. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned the flashlight toward the sound but didn't move closer. The beam reflected off the window, showing only the glare of light and darkness beyond. The sound stopped. I sat there, shaking, waiting for it to return. Didn't. When the first pale light of dawn came through, I grabbed my bag, opened the door, and started walking. I didn't even look back at the cabin. The dirt road was still wet from the rain, patches of mud sticking to my boots as I climbed the long hill that led back toward the highway. The forest was quiet except for birds starting to call. After about 2 miles, I saw fresh tire tracks in the mud. They hadn't been there when I arrived. A little farther ahead, near a bend, something caught my eye. On the edge of the road, half hidden by brush, was a small white plastic container, like a gasoline can. It was dented and stained, and near it were more of those same barefoot prints I'd seen by the cabin. They went off the road and disappeared into the trees. I didn't follow them. I kept walking until the road widened and I finally saw a power line in the distance. My phone got service again, just enough to make a call. When I reached the highway and got picked up hours later, I looked back toward the ridge one last time. From that angle, the forest looked calm, quiet, empty. No sign of the cabin. No movement in the trees. A few weeks later, I got a call from the rental company. They asked if I'd taken anything from the shed or damaged the door. Apparently, the next person who rented the cabin reported that the shed was wide open again, and that the ground inside looked like it had been dug up more since my stay. I didn't tell them what I saw. I didn't tell them about the prints or the sound on the porch. I just said no and hung up. But sometimes, late at night, when I think about that patch of dirt in the corner of the shed and those barefoot tracks facing the cabin, I wonder what or who was out there in the rain that night, and what they were trying to bury. It started as a simple trip, the kind I had done countless times before, but this one turned into something I would never forget. I had found a small, isolated cabin online, deep in the woods of a remote part of the state. The photos made it look rustic but cozy, surrounded by tall pine trees and with a small creek running nearby. The location promised peace, quiet, and a chance to disconnect. I was eager to get away from the city, from the constant noise and pressure, and I thought a weekend alone in the wilderness would be perfect. The drive was long. The closer I got, the narrower and rougher the roads became, until eventually I was following a thin gravel path that twisted between dense stands of trees. Sunlight barely reached the ground, and the air had that damp, earthy smell of moss and wet leaves. The GPS signal had already started to fail, and I found myself relying entirely on printed directions. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself was exactly as it appeared online. Modest, wooden, with a stone chimney and a small porch. There were no other buildings in sight, no signs of other people, nothing but the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. I unloaded my things and carried them inside. The cabin smelled faintly of dust and old wood, a mixture that somehow made it feel lived in but abandoned at the same time. There was a small fireplace, a worn couch, and a kitchen with basic supplies. I set my bag down and decided to explore the surrounding area before night fell completely. There was a narrow trail leading down toward the creek. The water was clear and cold, trickling over stones, and the trees grew so thick that the light from the cabin barely reached it. Birds were quiet. I didn't hear the usual noises of the forest, the rustle of squirrels, the chirping of crickets, but it wasn't alarming at first. Sometimes deep woods just had this heavy stillness. I spent the afternoon collecting firewood and stacking it by the fireplace. By the time I returned inside, the sky had turned the deep red and orange that comes just before sunset. I built a fire, the smell of burning pine filling the cabin. I cooked a simple meal over the flames, the soft crackling the only sound. I felt content, almost blissful, sitting there by myself. Yet, as darkness fully settled, the forest outside seemed to press closer to the cabin. The shadows stretched long and moved slightly in the wind. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that this was normal, that the quiet and darkness were part of the experience I had come here for. It started around 10 p.m., just after I had cleaned up from dinner. I had gone to the small window by the couch to close the curtains when I noticed something. There was a figure, or at least something that looked like a figure, standing between two trees just beyond the clearing. I froze. It was hard to make out details in the darkness, but it appeared to be tall, standing very still, looking directly at the cabin. My heart rate spiked. I convinced myself it might be an illusion, a tree shaped by shadows or a pile of rocks that looked like a person. I watched it for several minutes, and then it moved slightly, stepping back behind a tree, vanishing. I told myself again it was nothing, but I felt the first seed of unease. The rest of the night was restless. I stayed awake, listening to the forest. I could hear the faint sound of something moving through the leaves, slow, deliberate, never rushing. Each time I thought I had fallen asleep, a small noise would wake me. A branch snapping, the rustle of leaves near the cabin, something scraping lightly against the wooden exterior. My imagination ran wild. I tried to tell myself I was just alone in a strange place, that any noise was probably wildlife. But somewhere deep inside, I knew that the forest didn't usually move like this at night. Not without reason. The next morning, I went outside early, hoping that daylight would calm my fears. The figure wasn't there, and everything seemed normal. The air was crisp, the birds singing, the creek glinting in the morning sun. I felt a little relief, almost embarrassed by my fear the night before. I decided to take a walk down the trail along the creek, hoping the daylight would make me feel safe. But as I walked, I noticed something odd. In the soft mud near the water, there were footprints. They were large, not quite human, and they led along the edge of the creek into the forest. My heart sank. I traced them back toward the cabin in my mind. They hadn't come from the creek. I would have noticed if someone had entered from there, but they started somewhere deeper in the woods. I realized then that something, or someone, had been near the cabin while I was sleeping. I felt a mix of fear and adrenaline, and I hurried back to the cabin, checking every window and door. Everything appeared locked and undisturbed, but the footprints left no doubt. Someone had been close, too close. I spent the next day on edge, trying to stay busy. I stacked more firewood, cleaned the cabin, even tried cooking again. But my eyes kept darting to the windows, to the shadows just outside. That night, the noises returned. This time, louder. The scratching seemed to come from the roof, the side of the cabin, circling around as if testing the boundaries. I felt trapped, panic rising. I stayed close to the fire, keeping a large kitchen knife within reach, scanning the darkened walls through the windows. Every time I thought it had stopped, a branch would snap closer. A low scraping sound would travel across the cabin, and my pulse would spike. Sleep became impossible. I realized that I could not stay inside without a plan. The first light, I made a decision. I packed everything into my car and prepared to leave immediately. But when I tried to start the engine, the battery was dead. I cursed, running through the options. The cabin was isolated, cell signal non-existent, and the car was useless. I checked my surroundings. No one in sight, no cars on the path I had driven in on. The forest was silent, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I realized I would have to walk out. The main road was at least 3 miles away through dense woods. I considered leaving my bags, but they contained everything I owned for the weekend. I packed them tightly onto my back and started along the trail toward the road. The walk was agonizing. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping branch made me stop, my heart hammering. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I could see movement in the trees. There was a constant, low sound, like someone or something following at a distance, but never close enough to identify. Hours passed. I was exhausted, my legs sore, my mind fraying. At one point, I stumbled and fell into a patch of mud. My bag slipped from my shoulders, nearly dragging me further down the slope. I pulled myself up, dripping with dirt and soaked from sweat, and pressed on. Hunger and dehydration gnawed at me, but I forced myself to keep moving. The thought of getting back to civilization, of finding other people, was the only thing that kept me going. As the sun reached its peak, I finally broke through the thickest part of the forest. The road came into view, a gravel road that seemed almost impossibly straight compared to the twisted, narrow paths I had navigated. Relief washed over me in waves. I could see the occasional passing car far ahead, and I waved desperately until one stopped. The driver was an older man, clearly surprised to see someone so disheveled and mud-streaked emerging from the woods. I explained briefly about the cabin and my fear, and he offered to drive me back to town, where I could contact authorities. The car ride was long, but safe. With every passing mile, the fear that had gripped me began to fade, though it never completely left. I later learned that the cabin had a history. The previous owner had been forced to abandon it after multiple break-ins, vandals, and at least one case of someone lurking in the woods nearby. It had been sold cheaply to anyone who wanted seclusion, with the expectation that some risk came with the isolation. I realized that the figure I had seen, the sounds at night, the footprints, it wasn't supernatural, it wasn't imagined. It was a human presence, a real and dangerous person who had likely been watching the cabin for days, waiting for someone to be alone. The realization made me shiver, but it also made me feel a grim sort of relief. I had survived, and the danger, though terrifying, had been real and understandable. That clarity, that recognition of reality, gave me a sense of closure. Back in the city, I sold most of my outdoor gear. I avoided cabins for years afterward, choosing crowded hotels or lodges instead. Yet the memory remained vivid. The way the trees loomed, the scraping on the walls, the relentless feeling of being watched. I knew now how easy it was for someone to hide in the wilderness, and how alone a person could feel when truly isolated. The experience changed the way I approached solitude, planning, and personal safety. I became meticulous about checking cabins, informing others of my location, and always keeping a phone or radio signal I could rely on. In the end, the trip that began as a peaceful retreat became a harrowing lesson in caution, awareness, and survival. It ended safely, but it left its mark on me forever. A reminder that isolation is both alluring and dangerous, and that the woods are not always as empty as they seem. I had been driving for hours, the road narrowing and twisting as the sun sank low behind the mountains. The GPS signal was patchy, flickering on and off, and I had already missed the turnoff twice because the map app lagged. My plan was simple. A weekend alone in a cabin I had rented far from any town, just to clear my head and escape the constant noise of life. It wasn't unusual for me to seek isolation, but this time, the feeling of being truly alone in the wilderness came with a subtle, creeping weight. The cabin itself was tucked into a small valley surrounded by dense pine forests. From the road, it looked welcoming enough. A small wooden structure with a sloping roof and a stack of firewood neatly piled outside. There was no electricity, except what the generator provided, and I knew that the nearest neighbor was miles away. That isolation was part of the charm, but also part of the unease. The first thing I noticed when I got inside was the smell. Damp wood, old pine, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't identify. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the air settling in an unoccupied cabin. I dropped my bag near the door, then went straight to the windows. The forest outside stretched endlessly, dark and still except for the faint movement of the wind through the trees. Sunlight was fading fast, and the shadows between the trunks grew longer, almost like fingers stretching toward the cabin. I spent the next hour unpacking, arranging my things, checking the generator, and lighting a few lanterns. Everything seemed ordinary, but every now and then, I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, as though something in the woods was watching. I told myself it was paranoia. It was just me, alone, in a quiet, unfamiliar place. I tried to settle in, lighting a fire in the stone fireplace. The flames crackled, and the warmth made the cabin feel more secure. Night fell completely, and with it came a deeper darkness outside the cabin walls. The wind had picked up, rustling branches and sending dry pine needles skittering across the roof. That was when I first heard it. A faint, irregular sound, like footsteps, or perhaps something dragging across the ground, coming from somewhere near the cabin. I froze, straining to hear over the crackling fire. It stopped. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. But the sound didn't seem to match any animal I knew. It had a deliberate, almost cautious rhythm. I decided to ignore it. I locked the doors and double-checked the windows, then retreated to the fireplace. I tried to focus on the small comforts I had brought. A blanket, a notebook, some food. I told myself I was safe. But as the night wore on, the noises continued in sporadic bursts. Twigs snapping, the low brush of something moving in the undergrowth, and sometimes a heavier, thudding sound that made me sit up straight with my heart racing. Sleep was impossible. I stayed by the fire, staring into the flames, listening. Occasionally, I would glance at the windows, half expecting to see a shadow or a face. I never did. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. I tried reasoning with myself. There was no one here but me. Even if someone had been in the woods, why would they be silent until now? Still, the logical part of my brain fought against the primal fear growing in my chest. Around 2 in the morning, the noises changed. The footsteps, or whatever they were, started moving closer to the cabin. They circled around, pausing at intervals, heavy enough to feel through the floorboards. I remembered that the cabin was built on stilts over a small slope, so the floor was uneven and creaked in response to movement above or around it. I gripped a heavy kitchen knife I had brought for emergencies, though I hated to admit it. I didn't want to look outside. I didn't want to see whatever it was, but curiosity mixed with fear made me inch toward a window. Peering out into the dark, all I could see were tree trunks and the faint outline of the slope. The wind had died down, leaving an almost suffocating silence, and for a moment, the world outside seemed unreal, as though it had stopped. Then a shadow moved at the edge of my vision. Fast, deliberate, slipping between trees. My stomach dropped. Whatever it wasn't wandering. It was following a path, a route around the cabin. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening. Every so often, I would hear faint thumps, scraping, or the rustle of underbrush. I didn't dare leave the cabin. I didn't dare sleep. Morning felt like a miracle. The first pale light of dawn made the shadows in the forest less threatening. The wind returned, rustling leaves and bringing a faint scent of wet earth. I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there all night, waiting. During the day, I explored the area around the cabin cautiously. Nothing looked out of place at first. Animal tracks were everywhere, but some of them were larger than anything I could identify, and their pattern suggested careful, almost human-like movement. There were broken branches and flattened grass, as though something or someone had circled the cabin multiple times. The realization made me tense up. It hadn't been a deer, not a raccoon. Something was watching, moving with awareness and intention. I thought about calling for help, but the cell signal was minimal, barely enough to send a text. Even then, I was worried it wouldn't go through. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Someone could be hiding in the woods, waiting for me to let my guard down. I thought about leaving immediately, but the road was long and winding, and my car was parked a few hundred meters down the slope, out of sight from the cabin. I felt trapped. That night, I decided I had to take precautions. I reinforced the door with a heavy chair, moved the generator closer to the cabin in case I needed light or power, and stacked firewood around the windows to make it harder to break in. I didn't expect these measures to keep me safe completely, but I felt a small measure of control. The first hours of darkness passed without incident, but as midnight approached, the noises returned. Not just outside, but sometimes inside, faintly, the creak of floorboards or a shadow against the wall. I stayed awake again, eyes fixed on the windows, knife in hand. Hours passed. The air grew cold, my fingers numb from gripping the knife, my eyes dry from staring into the darkness. At some point, I heard something different. A low scraping noise at the edge of the deck outside the cabin. I froze. My heart felt like it would burst. The sound grew louder, deliberate, like someone testing the structure. It moved slowly along the side of the cabin, then stopped. I couldn't see anything through the thick darkness, and I didn't dare open a window. Then, the unexpected happened. A small figure emerged from the shadows. At first, I couldn't make it out, but it was clearly a person. An older man wearing ragged clothing, barefoot, with a long coat that blended into the dark. His movements were slow and careful, almost fragile, but the intent was undeniable. He circled the cabin, glancing in every window as though searching for something. Panic surged through me, but I didn't make a sound. I stayed hidden behind the curtains, holding my breath. Hours passed. He didn't attempt to break in, but he stayed close, moving along the perimeter of the cabin in patterns I couldn't predict. It became clear he was familiar with the area. He moved with a practiced stealth, like he had done this before. I realized I had to act before dawn, before he disappeared again into the forest. I formulated a plan. I needed to reach my car, get to a place with a signal, and call for help. I waited until the faint gray light of pre-dawn made shadows less reliable. Then I slipped quietly through the back door, carrying the knife and a small backpack with essentials. I kept low, sticking to cover, moving along the tree line. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow, and every step felt like it could give me away. It was a tense half-hour walk, with every rustle and snap of a branch making me freeze. I avoided the deck and the areas I had seen him near, staying in the underbrush. Finally, I reached the road and saw my car, just as I had left it, slightly hidden behind a small hill. Relief hit me like a wave, but I didn't let it weaken my caution. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The drive out of the valley was slow. The road was steep, covered with debris from the storm that had passed days earlier. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him following me, but there was no one. The forest seemed calm, but I knew better. I kept driving until the trees thinned and I reached a small town. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour gas station, shaking, exhausted, but safe. I reported the incident to the local authorities, describing the man and the patterns I had observed. They listened carefully, nodding, and promised to investigate. Later, I learned he had been living in the forest for months, hiding from authorities, scavenging for food, and occasionally approaching cabins, apparently out of curiosity or habit rather than malice. While the situation was resolved, the experience left me shaken. I understood then how isolation, darkness, and human unpredictability could be far more frightening than any story about ghosts or monsters. I returned home, grateful for civilization and safety. I avoided remote cabins for a long time, reflecting on how fragile a sense of security could be. The forest had been alive with presence, not supernatural, but real and unpredictable. It had taught me that fear is most potent when it is rooted in reality, when survival depends on sharp awareness and careful, measured action. And in the end, it was patience, caution, and respect for the wilderness and those who inhabited it that saved me, leaving a clear lesson. Fear can be survived, but only by staying vigilant and trusting your instincts. I had been planning this trip for months. The city's constant noise and pressure had been wearing me down, and I desperately needed solitude. I found a small, isolated cabin online, far enough from town that cell service was spotty, but not so far that I would be completely cut off. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. The reviews made it sound idyllic. A wooden cabin surrounded by dense forest, a small lake nearby, and miles of trails. I packed my things carefully, making sure I had all my essentials. Food, water, a first aid kit, a heavy-duty flashlight, matches, a small wood stove, and some extra batteries. I left the city early in the morning, taking my old Jeep along winding back roads until the asphalt gave way to gravel and dirt paths lined with towering pines. The closer I got, the quieter it became. The usual hum of traffic faded into nothing, replaced only by the occasional bird call and the rustle of wind in the trees. The GPS started losing signal, and I had to rely on the printed map I had brought along. The final mile was a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my Jeep, flanked on both sides by dense forest. I drove cautiously, my tires crunching over loose gravel, scanning the underbrush for any sign of wildlife or hidden hazards. Eventually, the cabin appeared. A simple, single-story wooden structure with a pitched roof, a small porch, and windows that reflected the forest like mirrors. I parked, got out, and stretched. The air smelled different here, clean, damp, and earthy. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The interior was sparse but comfortable. A small kitchen area, a wooden table, a few chairs, a sofa, and a wood-burning stove. There was a single bedroom with a modest bed, a dresser, and a small bathroom. The place smelled faintly of wood polish and old smoke. I set my bags down and opened the windows, letting in the fresh forest air. That first night, I made a fire in the stove and cooked a simple meal. I felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. The quiet was heavy, and every small noise, branches snapping, leaves rustling, sounded louder than it should. As the night went on, the wind picked up outside. It moaned through the trees, making the cabin creak. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal, that old cabins settle and the forest has its own sounds. I double-checked the locks on the doors, just in case. Sleep was restless. Every creak and rustle made me sit up and listen. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest was dense, the trees close together, and the underbrush thick. The trails were narrow and uneven, and the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. I walked for hours, noting animal tracks and listening to the occasional bird call. I felt isolated, but in a good way. It was exactly what I had come for, a break from everything. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, exhausted but satisfied. That evening, I cooked again and tried to relax. The wind had died down, and the forest seemed calm. I read a book by the fire, and for a moment I felt truly content. But then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Footsteps, outside, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I froze, listening. The steps moved around the cabin, stopping occasionally, then resuming. My heart started racing. I had told myself countless times that it was probably an animal, a deer, a raccoon, maybe a large bird landing on the roof. But something about the pattern, the weight behind the steps, felt different. Human. I grabbed the flashlight and peered out the window. Darkness. No figure, no movement. I strained my ears. The footsteps had stopped. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I checked all the doors again, double-locked them, and moved the furniture in front of the windows closest to the ground. I tried to calm myself, but my hands shook. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the stove, the flashlight resting across my lap, listening to every sound. Occasionally, I thought I heard movement outside, but each time I shone the flashlight into the darkness, nothing appeared. The next day, I debated leaving. I considered calling someone to check in, but my cell signal was weak. I felt trapped, but also stubborn. I refused to let fear ruin my trip. I ventured out again, trying to act normal, to convince myself that the footsteps had been nothing. I walked the trails, collected water from the stream near the cabin, and tried to stay calm. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, I was certain. They circled the cabin slowly, pausing as if testing the structure, listening, observing. My stomach churned, and I realized that I had no idea who or what was out there. Panic set in. I checked my supplies: knife, lighter, firewood, water. I fortified the doors as best I could and tried to stay quiet. Hours passed. The footsteps faded. I drifted into a light sleep, only to be woken by a sound like glass breaking. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and scanned the room. One of the kitchen windows had been cracked. The glass splintered. Whoever or whatever was outside had tried to get in. My heart pounded in my chest, and adrenaline surged. I grabbed my knife and stood by the bedroom door, listening. Nothing. The wind was calm, the forest silent, but I knew the threat was real. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to get out. I waited until first light. Darkness masked everything, and I didn't want to risk a confrontation at night. At dawn, I packed my essentials quickly, leaving non-essential items behind. I checked the Jeep, relieved to find it untouched. As I started the engine, I scanned the tree. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure watching me from the edge of the forest. It moved away, just a shadow now among the trees. I didn't stop to look. I drove as fast as the road allowed, my eyes constantly scanning the sides of the path. Every crack of a branch, every movement made me tense. I reached the main road and breathed a little easier. The city was far off, but I knew I was heading in the right direction. I didn't stop until I reached a small town where I could call someone. Anyone. My hands shook as I dialed a friend, explaining in fragmented words that I had to leave immediately. I found a small motel and spent the night there, unable to sleep, listening for any sounds outside. The next day, I debated leaving. I considered calling someone to check in, but my cell signal was weak. I felt trapped, but also stubborn. I refused to let fear ruin my trip. I ventured out again, trying to act normal, to convince myself that the footsteps had been nothing. I walked the trails, collected water from the stream near the cabin, and tried to stay calm. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, I was certain. They circled the cabin slowly, pausing as if testing the structure, listening, observing. My stomach churned, and I realized that I had no idea who or what was out there. Panic set in. I checked my supplies: knife, lighter, firewood, water. I fortified the doors as best I could and tried to stay quiet. Hours passed. The footsteps faded. I drifted into a light sleep, only to be woken by a sound like glass breaking. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and scanned the room. One of the kitchen windows had been cracked. The glass splintered. Whoever or whatever was outside had tried to get in. My heart pounded in my chest, and adrenaline surged. I grabbed my knife and stood by the bedroom door, listening. Nothing. The wind was calm, the forest silent, but I knew the threat was real. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to get out. I waited until first light. Darkness masked everything, and I didn't want to risk a confrontation at night. At dawn, I packed my essentials quickly, leaving non-essential items behind. I checked the Jeep, relieved to find it untouched. As I started the engine, I scanned the tree. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure watching me from the edge of the forest. It moved away, just a shadow now among the trees. I didn't stop to look. I drove as fast as the road allowed, my eyes constantly scanning the sides of the path. Every crack of a branch, every movement made me tense. I reached the main road and breathed a little easier. The city was far off, but I knew I was heading in the right direction. I didn't stop until I reached a small town where I could call someone. Anyone. My hands shook as I dialed a friend, explaining in fragmented words that I had to leave immediately. I found a small motel and spent the night there, unable to sleep, listening for any sounds outside. The next day, I returned home, exhausted and shaken. I called the local authorities to report the break-in and the attempted intrusion. They took my statement, though they seemed skeptical at first, suggesting it could have been an animal. I insisted it wasn't. The pattern of footsteps, the way the window had been broken, it was deliberate. They noted my concerns, promised to patrol the area more frequently, and gave me advice on cabin safety. Weeks passed, and I avoided cabins, hiking trips, and forests. I stayed in urban areas where I could feel secure, where help was always close by. But the memory of that cabin, the footsteps circling outside, the broken window, never left me. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how easily isolation could turn into danger. I also realized the importance of preparation, vigilance, and trusting instincts. Eventually, I went back to the forest, not to the cabin, but to nearby trails during the day with friends, always making sure I wasn't alone. The fear never fully disappeared, but I learned to manage it, to respect the wild and the unknown. That experience changed the way I approach solitude and safety, and I made sure never to underestimate the real risks of isolation again. I never returned to that cabin. It remains in my memory, a quiet, looming warning about how quickly peace can turn into fear, and how easily safety can be threatened in the silence of the forest. I learned that caution is never too much, and that instincts are invaluable. Life goes on, but some lessons leave a permanent mark. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. After a long stretch of work and city life that left me constantly drained, I wanted nothing more than to escape to the woods, to a cabin I had rented deep in the mountains. The map showed a small, winding road leading to it, and GPS only worked sporadically once I got past the main highway. That was part of the appeal, the isolation, the chance to be completely on my own. I packed my car with supplies: canned food, bottled water, firewood, a first aid kit, some extra blankets, and a small gas stove. I brought my laptop, but really, it was only for the rare emergency. I intended to spend the weekend completely offline. The drive started off ordinary. The road became narrower as I ascended into the mountains, trees pressing in on both sides. I passed a few houses at first, small cabins tucked into clearings, but the farther I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. The sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks by the time I reached the last junction indicated by the map. Here, the paved road gave way to gravel, and then to dirt, lined by thick evergreens that almost met overhead. The air smelled of pine and earth, sharp and clean. I took a deep breath, trying to feel the calm I had imagined, and pressed on. Eventually, the trees opened up to reveal the cabin. It was older, built of dark timber, with a stone chimney and a small porch. There was no electricity, but a small solar panel sat on the roof. It was simple, almost rustic, but sturdy. A narrow trail led from the dirt road to the cabin, and the car sank slightly in the soft soil as I parked. I got out and looked around. The forest was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a bird. The feeling of isolation hit me immediately. This was what I wanted, but now, standing there, I felt the subtle edge of unease that always comes with being completely alone in the wild. I unloaded my supplies and brought everything inside. The cabin smelled faintly of dust and old wood, a comforting earthy smell. There were a few small furnishings: a table, a couple of chairs, a bed in the corner, and a wood stove. I stacked firewood neatly by the hearth, checked the windows and doors, and lit a small fire. The warmth spread quickly, and the room glowed amber in the fading light. I ate a simple dinner and settled into a chair, trying to enjoy the quiet. But as the night grew darker, the forest outside seemed to shift in character. Shadows moved in ways that felt almost deliberate, and every distant sound, branch snapping, leaves rustling, made me flinch. Sleep did not come easily that first night. I could hear small animals moving outside, and at one point, a deeper, heavier sound, a branch breaking under the weight of something larger, echoed through the trees. I convinced myself it was a deer or some other animal, but I still felt my heart racing. I stayed awake until the fire died down, then dozed lightly, one ear straining for any unusual sound. The next morning, I explored the small clearing around the cabin. There was a narrow stream nearby and a thin path that wound into the forest. I decided to follow it for a while, curious to see how far I could go. The woods were dense, and the path was overgrown in places, but nothing felt threatening. Still, I carried a small knife in my pocket and kept an eye on the trail. After a couple of hours, I returned to the cabin, feeling tired but satisfied. I lit the stove, made some coffee, and tried to shake off the lingering tension from the previous night. The afternoon passed slowly. I read a book, tidied the cabin, and sat by the window, watching the forest. I noticed how the light shifted through the trees, and I thought about how peaceful it all seemed. Then something caught my eye, movement at the edge of the clearing. It was subtle at first, a shadow among the trees. I froze and stared. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bird or a deer, but the shape lingered, then vanished. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, I was deep in the woods, and shadows can play tricks on the eyes. That night, I prepared more carefully. I locked the doors and windows, stacked firewood near the stove, and laid out my supplies in case I needed them quickly. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned under the pressure. I sat close to the fire, trying to read, but my attention kept drifting to the dark forest outside. Then I heard it, a footstep, not like the small animals, but heavier, deliberate, moving just beyond the clearing. My stomach dropped. I didn't see anyone, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. I stayed quiet, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps circled, stopping occasionally. The sound of leaves crunching on the ground grew closer, then farther, as if whoever it was testing me. My mind raced. Could someone have followed me here? The area was supposed to be remote, but maybe someone had noticed the cabin was empty for the weekend. I thought about calling the police, but there was no cell service. My heart pounded as I searched the cabin for anything I could use for protection. I found an old hunting rifle in the corner, dusty but functional, and loaded it carefully, trying not to make a sound. Hours passed like this. The footsteps never returned, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I tried to sleep, but every noise made me startle. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was exhausted, tense, and on edge. I stepped outside cautiously, looking for any sign of intrusion. The cabin was untouched, the doors still locked, but the footprints in the mud around the clearing were clear. Large, heavy prints, not like any animal I recognized. Someone had been there, and they had been testing me. I spent hours that night planning. I moved furniture in front of the windows, prepared a simple barricade with chairs and the small table in the room, and kept my phone close. I also gathered all the tools I could find, kitchen knives, a hammer, a small hatchet, and laid them where I could reach them quickly. Every sound outside made me jump. The rustling of leaves, the creak of branches, the occasional snap of twigs, all made me flinch. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake until dawn, alert to every movement. The next morning, I decided I could not stay put. I had food and water, but the psychological toll of being watched was becoming unbearable. I packed quickly, taking only essentials, and left the cabin. I chose a path through the forest that ran parallel to the stream, hoping it would take me to the main road. The forest seemed alive with sound that day, birds calling, branches snapping underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I kept my eyes on every shadow, every movement. I felt relief whenever I saw sunlight breaking through the trees, a reminder that the world outside the forest still existed. After several hours of careful walking, I finally emerged onto the dirt road I had driven in on. The sunlight felt like a warm weight lifted from my chest. I looked back at the small clearing, at the cabin hidden among the trees, and a wave of relief and lingering fear washed over me. I drove back to the nearest town, stopped at a convenience store to collect myself, and called the cabin rental service to report what had happened. They were concerned, explaining that the cabin had been closed for maintenance before my booking, and no one was supposed to be there. They said they would send someone to inspect it. Over the next few days, I could not shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something worse. When the cabin owners later called me back, they confirmed that someone had indeed been staying in the cabin illegally. There was evidence of recent use, scraps of food, a small sleeping area, and footprints that did not match mine. They were grateful I had reported it and assured me they would increase security and patrol the area to prevent future incidents. In the end, I learned a few important lessons. The first was that the forest, while beautiful and peaceful, can hide danger. Human threat is often subtle, and it can be easy to dismiss signs of it until it is too late. The second was the importance of trusting one's instincts. Every time I had felt watched, every time my gut had tensed, it had been right. And finally, I learned the value of preparation and caution. Being alone in a remote area requires more than just enjoying the scenery. It requires vigilance, awareness, and practical steps to protect oneself. Even now, months later, I think about that weekend often. The quiet, the smell of the forest, the feel of sunlight filtering through leaves, but also the fear, the sense of someone else's presence, and the relief of escaping unharmed. It changed the way I approach solitude, the way I think about safety in the wilderness, and the way I respect the unpredictable nature of both humans and the wild. I no longer take isolation for granted, and I am always aware that danger can come quietly, in the most unexpected places. I never went back to that cabin. The experience was too real, too raw, and the fear it instilled too permanent. But I also came away stronger, more alert, and more capable of handling situations I would have once ignored. I learned that being alone is not the same as being safe, and that vigilance, preparation, and respect for the unknown are the only tools that can keep you unharmed when you venture into the wilderness. The cabin, the forest, and the fear remain with me, a reminder of the weekend that could have gone very differently, and of the careful, deliberate choices that kept me alive. I had been looking forward to a weekend away from the city for months. The constant noise, the endless crowds, and the pressure at work had left me drained. When I found the listing for a small cabin deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. The photos showed a modest structure, rustic but clean, surrounded by tall pines and a little stream that ran past the property. The idea of being completely alone in nature, with no one to disturb me, sounded perfect. I packed a backpack with food, water, a first aid kit, some extra clothes, and my journal, intending to spend 2 nights disconnected from everything and everyone. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. The paved road eventually turned into dirt, and the trees closed in on either side. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was low, and the light filtering through the branches made long, shifting shadows across the ground. At first, everything seemed exactly as it had in the photos. The cabin had a small porch, a stone chimney, and 2 windows that reflected the dimming light. I parked my car in the dirt lot, pulled my bag out, and unlocked the door. The smell of old wood and faint smoke from the chimney hit me immediately. It was faintly comforting, like the place had been lived in but not recently. The interior was simple. A single room with a small kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, a table, and a single bed pushed into a corner. There was a small bathroom with a toilet and a shower, all clean. I set my things down, made myself a simple dinner with the supplies I had brought, and then sat on the bed watching the last light fade from the forest outside. There was a strange stillness in the air, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than silence. I told myself it was just the forest at dusk, nothing more. That night I slept fitfully. The sounds of the forest, branches scraping together, the occasional snap of a twig, a distant bird, kept waking me. I told myself it was normal and eventually drifted into a shallow sleep. When I woke, it was late morning. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting moving patterns on the floor. I made coffee, poured it into a thermos, and decided to explore the area around the cabin. The clearing was small, surrounded by thick forest. A narrow trail led off into the woods, winding along the stream. I followed it for a while, enjoying the solitude and the smell of damp earth and pine. I returned to the cabin around midday, feeling relaxed and oddly light, as if the forest had absorbed some of the tension I carried with me. The afternoon passed uneventfully. I spent hours reading, writing in my journal, and sitting on the porch watching the shadows move among the trees. I had almost convinced myself that the weekend would be perfectly peaceful when I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the clearing, on the far side of the cabin, I saw a small indentation in the grass. It looked like someone had been walking there recently. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but the depressions were too deep and arranged in pairs. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself it was probably just another visitor who had left before I arrived. I had seen similar signs when hiking before, and I tried to calm myself. That night, I made a fire in the wood stove, cooking a simple dinner of canned beans warmed in a pan. The warmth from the fire was comforting, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, sleep did not come easily. Every small sound outside, the rustle of leaves, a branch falling, the occasional hoot of an owl, made me tense. I kept imagining shapes moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the window, but when I blinked, there was nothing. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the firelight and my imagination running wild. The next morning, I decided to go for a longer walk. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a flashlight and followed the trail deeper into the woods. The forest thickened, and the sunlight became dappled and weak. I followed the stream for a while, listening to the water trickle over rocks. At one point, I noticed some markings on a tree, scratches in the bark that looked too deliberate to be random. My stomach turned slightly. I had spent enough time in nature to know the difference between animal markings and human ones. These were deliberate, tallied marks, almost like someone had been counting something. I took note but pressed on, telling myself again that I was probably overreacting. When I returned to the cabin, the sense of unease had not gone away. I found another indentation in the grass near the cabin, this one fresher. It was definitely made by boots. Panic started to creep in. Someone had been here recently. I checked the windows and doors, all locked and intact, but the feeling of being watched was intense. I spent the rest of the day staying close to the cabin, stacking firewood near the door, and keeping my phone charged and ready. Even then, I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. That evening, as the sky darkened, I heard the sound of footsteps on the porch. My heart jumped, and I froze. The sound stopped as quickly as it started. I did not move for several minutes, listening. When I felt it was safe, I cautiously opened the door. Nothing. No one. No footprints on the porch. Nothing to indicate someone had actually been there. I checked the perimeter of the clearing by flashlight. Still nothing. The air felt colder than usual, the shadows longer and more oppressive. I realized I had to take action to protect myself. For the next day, I stayed vigilant. I avoided going too far from the cabin, checking the windows constantly, keeping the rifle nearby. The sense of isolation became oppressive. Even the friendly noises of birds and the stream felt suspicious now. I noticed more subtle signs. Branches snapped at odd angles, the undergrowth disturbed in ways that suggested someone moving carefully. I realized I had underestimated how vulnerable I was out here. By the second night, I had a plan. I gathered all my supplies, packed food and water, and loaded the rifle. I made sure everything was ready for a quick departure. Sleep was impossible. I could hear distant voices, or maybe whispers of wind, but every sound made me tense. I stayed by the window, watching the forest, waiting for any sign of movement. Around midnight, I saw a shadow shift near the tree line. Someone was out there. I waited, trying to stay calm. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, and for a moment, it froze as if looking right at the cabin. I realized then that my presence had been noticed. They had circled the cabin before, testing the perimeter, but now they were closer. I felt a surge of fear, but also determination. I would not be caught off guard. Suddenly, there was a louder sound, a branch breaking near the porch. I raised the rifle, pointed it through the window. The figure froze again, then turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't wait. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed in essentials, and slipped out the back door. The forest was pitch dark, and I moved carefully but quickly, using the faint moonlight to guide me. Every step was tense, alert, listening for any sign of pursuit. I followed a narrow animal trail that seemed to lead downhill, away from the cabin. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I forced myself to keep going. Hours passed and I saw no one. Eventually, the trail opened onto a small dirt road. Relief washed over me. I followed the road, hoping to find a main highway. Dawn broke, and with it, visibility improved. I saw a car parked ahead, another hiker who had stopped to rest. I waved frantically, and they pulled over immediately. I explained briefly, barely able to get the words out. They offered to drive me to the nearest town. By mid-morning, I was back in town, exhausted but safe. I called the police and reported the incident. They took notes but said that without evidence, it would be difficult to trace whoever had been at the cabin. I insisted they check the area eventually, providing the exact location. The thought that someone had been stalking the cabin, waiting for an opportunity, stayed with me for a long time. I never returned to that cabin. I kept the story to myself for months, only telling a close friend. The sense of isolation, the fear of being watched, the careful planning I had to employ just to escape. It changed me. I still go hiking and camping, but now I plan every detail, check every map twice, and make sure I am never alone in a place without cell service. That cabin in the mountains taught me that danger is not always visible, not always dramatic, but it can be real and close, waiting patiently. The ending, I realized, was not about confronting the threat. It was about surviving it, staying calm, and escaping. That lesson stayed with me, sharper than any fear I had felt before. A reminder of the thin line between solitude and vulnerability in the wilderness. Even months later, when I think about the cabin, the quiet woods, the dark nights, I remember the feeling of being utterly alone, the shadowy footsteps circling just beyond the edge of the clearing. And I am thankful I escaped, and that I survived by being alert, careful, and prepared. The memory is vivid, a permanent mark, but also a confirmation that preparation, attention, and calm thinking can carry you through even the most frightening, real-life situations. I had been driving for hours through the winding forest roads, the kind that twist and turn so tightly that every time you look at the map, it feels impossible that there could even be a road there. I was alone, my old SUV humming steadily beneath me, the headlights cutting through the thick shadows of towering pines. The plan was simple. A weekend away, a small cabin I had rented from a site online. Pictures showed a modest log cabin, a fireplace, a small porch overlooking a clearing, and a creek that ran behind it. The listing made it seem peaceful, isolated, perfect for unwinding. I didn't notice at first how far into the forest the cabin really was. The GPS stopped giving directions long before I got to the place. The signal lost among the dense trees. The road narrowed, then deteriorated into a dirt path, and the forest grew heavier around me. Shadows pressed close on all sides. The sun was starting to dip when I finally spotted the cabin, its shape almost swallowed by the trees. It was smaller than the pictures suggested, but solid. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, as if someone had been there recently. I parked, cut the engine, and the silence hit me immediately. It was heavier than normal forest silence. No wind rustling through the pines, no birds, not even the faint hum of insects, just silence. My chest felt tight, and I realized I had been gripping the steering wheel too long. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeps through your bones. Dust covered the wooden floor, and the smell of damp wood was strong. It felt abandoned, though I could have sworn I had seen smoke. I set down my bag and started checking the place. The furniture was old but functional. A small stove, a rickety table, a couple of chairs, a bed with a thin mattress. I noticed the fireplace had ashes in it, but nothing else. It seemed like someone had used it recently, maybe days ago. I shrugged it off, telling myself it didn't matter. I had brought my own supplies and food. Evening came quickly. The forest outside was an impenetrable wall of black, and the cabin felt smaller than it had in daylight. I lit a lantern and moved around, trying to feel comfortable, checking the locks on the doors and windows. All of them were fine, though the locks were old and stiff. I started to hear noises outside, faint at first. A branch snapping here, a rustle there. I thought it was probably an animal, deer, maybe a fox. But soon, the sounds grew sharper, closer, like something heavy moving just at the edge of the clearing. I felt my heart rate pick up. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest being alive. Still, I grabbed a small hatchet I had packed and kept it by my side. Night fell completely, and the forest became almost suffocating. Shadows pressed against the windows, and every sound became amplified. The rustling came closer, circling the cabin. I could hear branches crack under weight. My imagination raced. The logical side of me insisted it was probably a bear or a large animal, but another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there watching. I didn't sleep much that first night. Every few minutes, a loud snap of wood would echo from outside, and I would sit up, heart pounding, gripping the hatchet. At one point, I thought I saw a figure through the window, but when I blinked, it was gone. I tried not to panic. I kept telling myself there was no one around. This area was empty, the nearest house miles away. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I forced myself to leave the cabin, to stretch my legs and check the area. The forest was thick, the trees close together, and the sun barely penetrated the canopy. I walked to the creek, the air crisp, the water moving with a soft murmur. That was when I noticed footprints. Heavy ones, larger than mine and not quite human in shape. They were fresh, pressed into the damp soil by the water's edge, leading from the forest to the edge of the clearing where my cabin sat. My stomach sank. Whoever or whatever had been here had been watching me. I hurried back to the cabin, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The cabin looked the same, quiet, still. I locked all the doors again, barricaded the weakest window with a chair, and tried to calm myself. The feeling of being observed didn't go away. I spent the day inside, keeping the lanterns lit even though sunlight filtered through the windows. Every little noise, branches breaking, leaves rustling, made me tense. By evening, it became clear that whatever had left the footprints was still around. I noticed more signs, small things at first. A branch bent near the door, footprints pressed into the soft earth around the cabin. A small rock that hadn't been there before sitting by the porch steps. I began thinking clearly. This wasn't an animal. Animals didn't approach and inspect cabins. Animals didn't leave deliberate traces around the doors. I started planning. If someone was out there, I had to protect myself. I dug out an old, rusty rifle I had packed for emergencies, checked it carefully, and made sure it was loaded. I kept it by the bed, ready. I reinforced the door with the chairs and table, stacking them as best I could. I started moving quietly, checking the windows, listening. At one point, I saw a shadow move across the far edge of the clearing. I froze, holding my breath, watching. It didn't approach, didn't leave, just lingered at the edge of sight. That night, the noises became more deliberate. I could hear slow footsteps around the cabin, pacing, something heavy scraping against the wall. At one point, a rock hit the window with a dull thud. My heart raced. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake all night, rifle ready, listening. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. Morning revealed more evidence. Scratches on the wooden siding, deeper footprints, and faint marks that suggested someone had tried to pry the door open. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to think. I couldn't stay. I couldn't wait for whoever it was to make a mistake. I packed what I could carry, leaving heavier items behind. The plan was simple. Make it to the main road, find help. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, the asphalt smooth and open. Only then did I breathe. The tension left my body in heavy, shivering waves. I didn't know if it had been someone stalking me, or a group, or even just my mind playing tricks, but the fear was real, and I didn't want to find out. I returned home that evening, the city lights bright and comforting. I called the local sheriff the next day and reported the cabin and the tracks. They sent someone out, a pair of deputies who examined the area. They found evidence that someone had been living rough in the forest near the cabin, making temporary shelters and moving silently. No one had been inside the cabin while I was there, but they confirmed that whoever it was had been observing it for days. They warned me that it wasn't unusual for desperate people to watch remote cabins, hoping for a target. They had likely abandoned the area when they realized I wasn't alone or had left signs of occupancy. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of those knocks, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. But I also felt lucky, almost foolishly lucky, that I had survived the encounter without confronting anyone. I never returned to that cabin. I stopped seeking isolation in remote places and learned that solitude in nature could be dangerous, even when no one else seems around. The memory of the forest, the cabin, and the presence that never fully revealed itself stayed with me, a reminder of the thin line between safety and vulnerability, and how quickly it can vanish. Eventually, I started to take day trips instead, hiking trails where other people were around, cabins and lodges with neighbors and caretakers. I kept a knife with me, checked the locks, and stayed aware of every sound, every movement. I had learned to respect the wilderness not just for its beauty, but for the fact that it hides more than just trees. Looking back now, I realized that the scariest part wasn't the unknown figure, the knocks, or even the footprints. It was the awareness that someone could be so close, unseen, and that I was powerless to stop them. And that awareness stayed with me far longer than the weekend ever did. I never felt truly safe again in complete isolation, and I never again underestimated how quickly a peaceful forest can turn into a place where fear becomes real and immediate. Over the next few days, the tension only increased. I began to notice small things. Objects slightly moved from where I had left them. A small pile of dirt near the door that hadn't been there before, and more footprints around the cabin, shallow impressions that were unmistakably human. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a local hunter had wandered close by, curious about the cabin. Maybe it was animals, large ones that could knock over light objects. But every explanation felt thin, unsatisfying, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. One morning, I found something that finally broke any pretense of calm. I had gone to fetch water from the nearby stream, a short walk from the cabin. The path was muddy and slippery from the rain, but it was safe enough in daylight. When I returned, I noticed that the cabin's back window, which I had thought locked, was now open just a few inches. Nothing inside was disturbed, but the fact that it was open at all made my blood run cold. I checked all the doors again and discovered subtle scratches around the lock, marks that suggested someone had tried multiple times to force entry. My heart pounded as I considered the implications. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't imagination. Someone had been in my cabin while I was away. From that moment, I began a strict routine. Every time I left, I inspected the windows and doors, checked the surrounding area for signs of movement, and kept a heavy stick close at hand. I avoided exploring too far into the woods, staying close to the cabin and keeping my eyes peeled. But the fear was relentless. It followed me everywhere, even when I was inside, sitting quietly, trying to eat, or attempting to sleep. I would wake suddenly, convinced I had heard someone moving outside, only to find empty shadows and the faint, eerie sound of the wind. One afternoon, I made a mistake. I had stepped out to gather firewood, thinking the daylight and distance from the cabin would make me safe. I wandered a bit further than usual, underestimating how quickly the dense trees could obscure my view. When I returned, I saw tire tracks in the muddy driveway, a set of narrow, deep impressions that hadn't been there when I left. They stopped right outside the cabin. Panic struck me instantly. I ran to the door, checked the windows, and noticed the unmistakable sight of a footprint in the dust on the kitchen floor. Fresh, human, too large to be mine. Fear turned into urgency. I packed my belongings hastily, leaving anything unnecessary behind. I made a plan to leave immediately, driving back along the narrow, twisting road toward civilization. But as I approached my car, I noticed something that froze me in place. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, partially obscured but clearly human. I couldn't make out details, but I could feel the intensity of its gaze. I froze, weighing my options. If it had seen me, any sudden movement could provoke it. But after a tense moment, it moved slowly back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove as fast as the narrow road would allow, ignoring the occasional skid in the mud, ignoring the way my hands shook violently. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I allowed myself to breathe fully. The city lights, the hum of traffic, and the distant sound of people felt like safety itself. I called the authorities immediately, reporting the break-ins and the strange figure I had seen. They came out a few days later, investigated, and found evidence of repeated intrusion. Footprints, tampered locks, and even a makeshift camp someone had been using near the tree line, hidden just enough to avoid casual detection. They never caught anyone in the act, but the evidence confirmed what I had feared all along. I had not been imagining things. In the weeks afterward, I stayed with friends, too shaken to return to the cabin. Even now, months later, the memory of those nights lingers. I replay the small details endlessly: the creak of the porch, the scratches on the lock, the figure watching me from the trees. But I also learned something important. I learned to trust my instincts, to take subtle signs seriously, and most of all, to value my safety over the illusion of solitude. Eventually, I sold the cabin. The buyers were warned about the potential risks, though I suspect they were mostly interested in the price and the scenery. For me, that experience remains a cautionary tale about isolation, vigilance, and the very real dangers that can hide behind the comforting guise of nature. It was a terrifying ordeal, but it ended clearly. I survived, I escaped, and I carried the lesson with me. I may still walk cautiously on quiet paths or hesitate before stepping into dense woods alone, but I have no illusions about the world. It is not haunted by ghosts, nor does it rely on fairy tales. It is filled with real threats, and sometimes, the scariest moments come not from imagination, but from the undeniable reality of someone else's presence where you thought you were truly alone. I had been driving for hours along a narrow, winding forest road, the kind where the trees grow so close to the asphalt that sunlight barely reaches the pavement. I wasn't sure why I had decided to spend the weekend alone in a cabin this remote. Part of me wanted solitude, the quiet that comes from being far from people, far from phones, far from anything familiar. But part of me, deep down, knew that isolation could be dangerous. I shrugged off that thought as paranoia and turned the key in the ignition, the engine growling against the silence of the early evening. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Tucked behind a thick grove of pine and cedar, it looked almost forgotten, as if someone had built it and then decided the wilderness was too much to handle. The wood siding was weathered to a dull gray, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. Windows were dusty, and the path from the road to the cabin was overgrown, with roots twisting under the fallen needles and leaves. As I stepped out of my car, the smell of damp earth and pine sap filled the air, sharp and sweet. The sun was just dipping behind the trees, and the shadows were stretching long and dark across the forest floor. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, but otherwise it was clean. There was a small kitchen area, a wood stove, a table with a few chairs, and a loft with a bed. I set my bag down and ran my hands along the walls, noting the uneven boards, the slight gaps where the wind might whistle through. The place had electricity, barely. The lights flickered when I switched them on, but it was enough. I started a fire in the stove, the wood dry and easy to light, and settled into a chair by the fire with a mug of coffee I had brought. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, a constant whisper that made the cabin feel both alive and abandoned at the same time. I tried to focus on the fire, letting its warmth settle into me, telling myself that being alone wasn't dangerous. That's when I first noticed the sound. It was faint at first, a scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. I froze, straining to hear it over the wind and the crackle of the fire. The sound stopped. I waited, telling myself it was probably just a branch falling, maybe an animal, a deer or a raccoon. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it lingered, creeping up my spine like a slow hand. Night came quickly. The fire had burned low, and I added more wood, the sparks flying up into the chimney. That's when I noticed the footprints. Outside the small front window, pressed into the soft, damp earth, were tracks leading from the edge of the trees to the cabin door. They were large, like someone wearing boots, and they stopped abruptly at the door. My heart started to race, the firelight flickering across the walls as I moved closer to the window. There was no sign of a car on the road. Whoever had made these tracks had come on foot. I checked the doors and windows. They were all locked. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing obvious that anyone had been inside. But the tracks were real. Someone had been here, close enough to touch the door, and now they were gone, blending into the shadows. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could have been an animal, maybe a bear pressing its paws against the door, but the shape of the prints was wrong. Too tall, too wide. I stayed awake most of the night, sitting near the fire, the stove cracking and popping. Every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. The wind sounded like it was moving through the trees in unnatural patterns, and every sound seemed closer, sharper, as if the forest was pressing against the cabin. I didn't sleep. I didn't even dare lie down. I just kept the fire going and waited for the sun to rise. Morning brought light, and with it, a small measure of relief. I could see the forest clearly now, the way the sunlight hit the tree trunks and the moss-covered ground. The tracks from the night before had faded in the rain that had come down overnight, but I could still see them faintly. Whoever had been there was gone. I decided to stay inside that day, keeping the doors locked, watching the trees from the windows. I noticed small details I hadn't before. The way the branches moved, the way shadows shifted on the ground, the faint rustle of movement just beyond the edge of the clearing. By the second night, I had started to hear it again. This time, it was not just scraping or rustling. There were knocks, soft, deliberate taps, coming from the cabin walls themselves. I would be in the kitchen, preparing a small meal, and I would hear it on the far side of the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. I checked the doors and windows again. Everything was secure. I even checked the loft where the bed was, and there was nothing. No one. But the knocks continued, random at first, then more rhythmic, more confident. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every time I moved, it seemed to follow. When I sat near the fire, it would come from the kitchen wall. When I moved to the kitchen, it would come from the loft. I started keeping a knife with me, just a kitchen knife, but something about its weight made me feel slightly safer. I couldn't tell if it was human or animal. The knocking was precise, almost intelligent, and that terrified me more than anything else. The third day, I made a decision. I needed to leave. I couldn't stay here. I packed my bag quickly, checking each lock and making sure I had everything. As I was about to step outside, I noticed the tracks again. This time, they were fresh, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin, stopping at the window. They were larger than my feet, heavy boots, and they pressed into the soft dirt. My stomach twisted. Someone had been watching me, waiting. I wanted to run, but I didn't know if that was safer. I decided to go anyway. I ran to the car, sliding the door open, throwing my bag into the back seat. The engine roared to life, and I looked up at the trees. Movement, shadows shifting between the trunks. I drove fast, not looking back. The forest road was narrow, and the car bounced over roots and potholes. Every branch that scraped the sides of the car sounded like a hand reaching through the window. I had been looking forward to a weekend away from the city for months. The constant noise, the endless crowds, and the pressure at work had left me drained. When I found the listing for a small cabin deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. The photos showed a modest structure, rustic but clean, surrounded by tall pines and a little stream that ran past the property. The idea of being completely alone in nature, with no one to disturb me, sounded perfect. I packed a backpack with food, water, a first aid kit, some extra clothes, and my journal, intending to spend 2 nights disconnected from everything and everyone. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. The paved road eventually turned into dirt, and the trees closed in on either side. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was low, and the light filtering through the branches made long, shifting shadows across the ground. At first, everything seemed exactly as it had in the photos. The cabin had a small porch, a stone chimney, and 2 windows that reflected the dimming light. I parked my car in the dirt lot, pulled my bag out, and unlocked the door. The smell of old wood and faint smoke from the chimney hit me immediately. It was faintly comforting, like the place had been lived in but not recently. The interior was simple. A single room with a small kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, a table, and a single bed pushed into a corner. There was a small bathroom with a toilet and a shower, all clean. I set my things down, made myself a simple dinner with the supplies I had brought, and then sat on the bed watching the last light fade from the forest outside. There was a strange stillness in the air, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than silence. I told myself it was just the forest at dusk, nothing more. That night I slept fitfully. The sounds of the forest, branches scraping together, the occasional snap of a twig, a distant bird, kept waking me. I told myself it was normal and eventually drifted into a shallow sleep. When I woke, it was late morning. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting moving patterns on the floor. I made coffee, poured it into a thermos, and decided to explore the area around the cabin. The clearing was small, surrounded by thick forest. A narrow trail led off into the woods, winding along the stream. I followed it for a while, enjoying the solitude and the smell of damp earth and pine. I returned to the cabin around midday, feeling relaxed and oddly light, as if the forest had absorbed some of the tension I carried with me. The afternoon passed uneventfully. I spent hours reading, writing in my journal, and sitting on the porch watching the shadows move among the trees. I had almost convinced myself that the weekend would be perfectly peaceful when I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the clearing on the far side of the cabin, I saw a small indentation in the grass. It looked like someone had been walking there recently. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but the depressions were too deep and arranged in pairs. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself it was probably just another visitor who had left before I arrived. I had seen similar signs when hiking before, and I tried to calm myself. That night, I made a fire in the wood stove, cooking a simple dinner of canned beans warmed in a pan. The warmth from the fire was comforting, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, sleep did not come easily. Every small sound outside, the rustle of leaves, a branch falling, the occasional hoot of an owl, made me tense. I kept imagining shapes moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the window, but when I blinked, there was nothing. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the firelight and my imagination running wild. The next morning, I decided to go for a longer walk. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a flashlight and followed the trail deeper into the woods. The forest thickened, and the sunlight became dappled and weak. I followed the stream for a while, listening to the water trickle over rocks. At one point, I noticed some markings on a tree, scratches in the bark that looked too deliberate to be random. My stomach turned slightly. I had spent enough time in nature to know the difference between animal markings and human ones. These were deliberate, tallied marks, almost like someone had been counting something. I took note but pressed on, telling myself again that I was probably overreacting. When I returned to the cabin, the sense of unease had not gone away. I found another indentation in the grass near the cabin, this one fresher. It was definitely made by boots. Panic started to creep in. Someone had been here recently. I checked the windows and doors, all locked and intact, but the feeling of being watched was intense. I spent the rest of the day staying close to the cabin, stacking firewood near the door, and keeping my phone charged and ready. Even then, I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. That evening, as the sky darkened, I heard the sound of footsteps on the porch. My heart jumped, and I froze. The sound stopped as quickly as it started. I did not move for several minutes, listening. When I felt it was safe, I cautiously opened the door. Nothing. No one, no footprints on the porch, nothing to indicate someone had actually been there. I checked the perimeter of the clearing by flashlight. Still, nothing. The air felt colder than usual, the shadows longer and more oppressive. I realized I had to take action to protect myself. I stepped outside cautiously. The clearing looked empty, but the forest edge felt alive with presence. I moved slowly, every step deliberate, scanning constantly. Halfway to my vehicle, I heard a loud snap behind me. I froze, heart pounding. Branches moved violently, and a figure emerged, just for a moment, before disappearing back into the forest. My instincts screamed to run. I broke into a sprint, diving into the SUV, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. Driving out of the forest felt like escaping a trap. Every bend in the road made me glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station a good 10 miles out, shaking, covered in sweat, breathless. The attendant looked at me like I was crazy when I asked to call the police. I didn't give him details at first, just enough to get them on the line. When the police arrived, they searched the area I described. Tracks, signs of forced entry, and even a makeshift campsite in the woods nearby were found. Whoever had been there was long gone, but it was clear they had been watching, waiting, probably for weeks. They had abandoned the cabin only after seeing me arrive. I realized how lucky I had been. Just a few more hours, a few more mistakes, and things could have ended very differently. I didn't go back. The cabin was removed from listings, the owners claiming maintenance issues, but I knew better. Whoever had been there wasn't just another renter or a hiker. They had been living in the woods, patient, deliberate, and they had targeted me by chance. That thought stayed with me for weeks. Every rustle in the bushes, every shadow in a dark room, made my heart race. I moved out of the city near the forest. I never took another solo trip into the woods again. Even now, years later, I remember every detail. The way the silence pressed against the cabin walls, the fresh footprints by the creek, the heavy presence lingering just at the edge of vision. It changed the way I saw the world, the way I traveled. I survived, yes, but the memory of being watched, of knowing someone had been waiting for me, is something I'll never forget. And the most terrifying part is knowing they were patient, they were careful, and they were still out there somewhere, blending perfectly with the forest, waiting for the next person to wander too far in. It started as an ordinary plan, one I had imagined countless times but never acted upon. I had been working non-stop for months, buried under piles of paperwork and endless deadlines. My mind had begun to feel heavy and claustrophobic, as if it were trapped in a small, dimly lit room with no windows. I needed to escape, and I needed it badly. That's why I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city, far from people, far from everything that reminded me of responsibility. The listing had promised isolation, peace, and the kind of quiet that left nothing but the sound of wind through trees and the occasional bird call. When I first arrived, the drive through winding dirt roads was already unnerving. The trees grew close together, their trunks twisted and gnarled, casting long shadows even in the late afternoon sun. The road narrowed, becoming little more than a single lane with tall grass creeping in from both sides. Occasionally, the canopy above would block the sunlight entirely, and I found myself driving in semi-darkness, though it was only 3 in the afternoon. I remember gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, feeling an odd tension that I couldn't quite explain. The cabin itself was older than I had expected, but sturdily built. Weathered wood panels darkened by years of rain and sun gave it a rugged look, and moss had grown along the roof and the corners of the walls. The small porch creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the car, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. I had chosen this cabin because it had no cell reception, a fact I now realized might become more terrifying than I had anticipated. The thought of being completely cut off from the world made a strange knot form in my stomach, one that wasn't entirely fear but something deeper, more primal. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, dust, and a faint mustiness, like it had been shut up for weeks. The interior was sparse. A small kitchenette, a simple table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, and a wood stove that had clearly not been used in a while. I walked through each room slowly, touching the rough wooden surfaces, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. Everything felt real, tangible, but there was also something oddly oppressive about it. It wasn't cold, not yet, but the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should have been, stretching farther than the weak afternoon light could justify. That first night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing sounds, subtle things, like the rustle of leaves just outside the windows, the snap of a branch falling somewhere in the distance. At first, I tried to tell myself it was normal. Animals, wind, the old cabin settling. But as hours passed and the darkness deepened, I became hyper-aware of every creak and groan. The wind began to whistle through small cracks in the window frames, and I could hear the gentle tap of rain against the roof, though it was uneven, almost as if someone were walking lightly across the shingles. By the second day, I had begun exploring the surrounding area. A narrow dirt path led deeper into the woods, and I followed it until the trees became thicker, the air colder, and the silence heavier. It was the kind of quiet that pressed down on your ears, making you feel as if your own heartbeat was too loud, too intrusive. I began to notice other signs. Faint footprints in the mud, too small to be mine, too crisp to have been made days ago. At first, I rationalized it. Someone else must have been here, a hiker perhaps, passing through. But the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt, and the more impossible it seemed that anyone could have been there without me noticing their approach. I returned to the cabin with a strange unease clinging to my skin. That evening, I noticed something else. The door latch, which I had secured myself every time I went out, was slightly misaligned. It wasn't broken, but it looked like someone had tried to force it and failed. My stomach tightened, and I double-checked all the windows. Everything else was exactly as I had left it, yet that subtle misalignment was enough to make my heart race. I told myself it must have been my imagination, a result of the anxiety I had brought with me. That night, sleep became nearly impossible. Every sound made me tense. The wind, the rain, the distant rustle of branches. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps inside the cabin. My eyes shot open, but there was nothing there. I gripped the edge of the mattress and forced myself to listen, counting each creak, each tap. Hours passed in agonizing tension. When dawn finally arrived, the light felt like a relief, a shield against the unknown that had haunted me through the night. I decided to secure everything. I checked the doors, the windows, the locks. I even piled more wood against the front door to make it harder to open from the outside. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the unease. That night, the noises returned, louder, more deliberate. I stayed awake, watching the windows, waiting. The scratching was constant now, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Then I heard something new, the sound of footsteps on the roof above the loft. My pulse skyrocketed. I stayed frozen, trying to hear clearly, convincing myself it must be an animal large enough to climb. But the weight, the slow steps, they were too deliberate, too heavy to be any raccoon or deer. I spent the entire night sitting in a corner of the main room, near the fireplace, with a baseball bat I'd brought just in case. Couldn't sleep. I didn't dare make noise. At dawn, the wind died down, and the forest was silent again. I ventured outside carefully, inspecting the roof. There were scuff marks, scratches in the shingles, deep enough to be noticeable. It was clear, whatever had been on the roof, it wasn't small. My stomach sank. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin, avoiding the trails. I didn't want to encounter whoever or whatever had been there. I noticed other signs. Small items I'd left outside. A chair, a bucket had been moved slightly. I couldn't see footprints, but the disturbances were there. I decided I couldn't just sit and wait for them to come back. I needed a plan. I gathered my things, considering leaving immediately. But the forest was dense, and the cabin's position was remote. Any path I took could be treacherous. That night, the sounds returned, more aggressive this time. The scratching was louder, accompanied by thuds, like someone was trying to force entry. I gripped the bat tightly, pacing the room, waiting for the inevitable. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and then I heard it, the front door handle rattling. My stomach dropped, and I stayed still, heart hammering. The rattling stopped, and silence returned. I dared not breathe. I stayed like that until first light. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed quickly, grabbing only essentials, careful to make noise as little as possible. I left a note inside, explaining my departure in case anyone came after me, though I doubted they would. I started the SUV and drove down the winding road, eyes constantly scanning the trees, expecting to see someone following, but there was nothing. The further I drove, the more I began to breathe normally again. By the time I reached the main highway, the tension in my body eased slightly. Looking back now, I realize how lucky I was. That cabin, isolated and remote, had been perfect in appearance, but the isolation itself made it terrifying. Someone had been observing, tracking, and testing me in ways I couldn't anticipate. I never saw them clearly, never had proof beyond the disturbances, the scratches, and the footprints, but the fear I felt was real, raw, and unrelenting. In the days after, I reported the situation to local authorities. They took my statements seriously, though they admitted that in such remote areas, it was often impossible to track down intruders unless there was a direct confrontation. They told me to avoid returning to that location. I never did. Since that trip, I've been cautious in ways I hadn't considered before. I research every remote location, check local records for reports of trespassing or suspicious activity, and always ensure I have an exit plan. I still enjoy solitude, but the memory of that cabin, the sounds, the scratches, the steps on the roof, remains vivid. It serves as a lesson. Isolation is only peaceful when it's safe. I never went back to the mountains where that cabin stood. I learned that what makes a place feel safe isn't always what it appears to be. That fear, that tension, and the sense of being watched shaped me in a way I hadn't expected. Even now, years later, I remember the scrape on the roof, the movement in the shadows, and the footprints circling my temporary home. I learned to respect the unknown in practical, realistic ways. Locking doors, checking perimeters, trusting instincts. That cabin trip became more than a vacation. It became a hard-earned education in vigilance and survival in solitude. In the end, I escaped unharmed, but the experience left a permanent mark. The peace I sought was replaced with awareness, the isolation replaced with careful observation, and the comfort of a cabin in the woods replaced with a cautious respect for what could lurk unseen. I returned to the city, returned to normal life, but I carry the memory of that remote place with me always. A reminder that even ordinary-looking locations can hide extraordinary dangers, and that preparation, awareness, and caution are the only shields against them. I had been planning this trip for months, and by the time I finally loaded my backpack into my car, I was filled with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. The cabin I was going to was in a remote part of the mountains, far away from the nearest town, and I liked the idea of being alone with nature for a few days. My work had been relentless lately, leaving me drained, and I thought that spending time completely isolated would help me clear my mind. I packed carefully, making sure I had all the essentials: food, water, warm clothing, a first aid kit, matches, a flashlight, and some extra batteries. I had always been cautious, never one to leave things to chance, especially when I was venturing into a place where help might not come for hours or days. The drive itself was long but peaceful at first. The road wound through small towns and stretches of open countryside, gradually giving way to dense forests and steep hills. As the asphalt disappeared under layers of gravel and dirt, the landscape changed into one that was wild and untamed. I watched the trees grow taller, the shadows deepen, and the silence become almost complete, broken only by the occasional cry of a bird or the rush of wind through the branches. I had been told the cabin was tucked deep in a secluded valley, accessible only by a narrow, barely maintained dirt track. The directions I had gotten were vague, but I had a GPS and a good sense of direction, so I didn't worry too much. By the time I reached the small trailhead, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long, orange streaks across the sky. I parked my car on a rough patch of dirt, checked my backpack one last time, and started walking toward the cabin. The path was uneven, with tree roots and rocks jutting out at awkward angles, forcing me to watch my step constantly. Every now and then, I would glance up at the thickening forest around me, the shadows of the trees twisting and shifting as the light faded. Even though I had been hiking many times before, something about this trail made me tense. There were no signs of people anywhere, no distant houses, no sounds of traffic. Just the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen animal's foot. The cabin appeared after nearly 2 hours of trudging through the forest. It was smaller than I had imagined, made of rough-hewn logs, with a steep roof and a tiny porch. There was a single window on the front and a heavy wooden door, which looked like it had been reinforced at some point. The place had an air of abandonment, but it also seemed solid and secure. I placed my backpack inside, then set about lighting a fire in the old stone fireplace. The cabin had a simple interior. A small kitchen area with a cold, metal sink, a table with 2 chairs, and a tiny loft above where the bed was tucked into the corner. I unpacked some supplies, laid out the food I had brought, and finally let myself relax as the fire crackled to life. At first, everything felt calm and pleasant. I had this strange satisfaction in knowing I was completely alone, that nothing could disturb me here except nature itself. I spent the first evening collecting firewood, exploring the perimeter of the cabin, and making mental notes of possible escape routes in case something went wrong. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, the soft hum of insects settling for the night, and the distant trickle of a stream somewhere in the valley. I slept relatively well that night, wrapped in a thick blanket and feeling the warmth of the fire against the cold, wooden floor. The next day, I woke early, determined to explore the surrounding forest. I wanted to understand the area, know where water sources were, and perhaps find a trail I could follow for longer hikes. As I ventured further from the cabin, I noticed subtle signs of wildlife. Broken twigs on the ground, tufts of fur caught in the branches, faint tracks in the mud. The forest was alive, but it also had this oppressive silence at times, the kind that makes your own movements feel amplified, almost loud in comparison. I reminded myself to stay alert, moving carefully and keeping my eyes peeled for any danger. That afternoon, I came across a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees. Sunlight filtered through in thin beams, illuminating patches of moss and fallen leaves. The scene was beautiful, almost serene, but there was a sudden rustle in the underbrush that made me freeze. I held my breath, scanning the shadows, and then a deer bolted across the clearing, disappearing back into the forest. My heart was still racing as I continued to explore, aware that I was in someone else's territory, even if that someone was a wild animal. As the day waned, I returned to the cabin, carrying a small bundle of firewood I had collected along the way. That night, I prepared a simple meal on the old stove, letting the smell of cooked food fill the small space. I ate slowly, listening to the forest outside, which had grown louder with nocturnal life. The chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, and the occasional thump of something large moving through the trees. I felt a mild unease, but nothing alarming. Yet, the following morning, I awoke to an unusual quiet. The birds were silent, the wind had died down, and the forest felt oddly still. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the calm before the inevitable morning activity of wildlife. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. There were footprints around the cabin. I froze, staring at them. They were human, large, booted prints, fresh, pressed into the soft soil. My heart started beating faster. I had been sure I was alone. No one had been on the trail when I arrived, and the area was remote. I scanned the forest, but there was nothing, just the trees and shadows. I told myself to stay calm, that maybe it was a hiker or a ranger passing through, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I spent the morning fortifying the cabin as best I could. I checked the locks, stacked extra firewood near the doors, and even moved some heavy furniture to make it harder for anyone to enter quickly. The sense of unease grew as the day passed. Every noise outside made me tense. The snapping of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the soft crunch of footsteps that could be mine or could be someone else's. I decided to limit my movements outside and stayed inside, scanning the windows and listening. By the third night, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I couldn't shake it, no matter how I tried. Every shadow seemed to move in unnatural ways. Every small sound sounded amplified and threatening. I made sure my flashlight and extra batteries were within reach, kept a heavy metal pipe beside the door, and stayed close to the fireplace for warmth and light. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, and I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Sleep was impossible. I spent hours crouched near the fire, listening. I thought I heard voices once, muffled, distant, but when I strained to focus, there was only silence. On the fourth day, I decided I could not stay passive anymore. I needed to understand what was happening, to know if I was in danger from another human. I spent the morning quietly scouting the perimeter of the cabin, moving slowly, watching for any signs of someone nearby. That's when I noticed something chilling. There were more footprints, some leading away from the cabin and some returning. They circled around the building, as if whoever had made them was observing me without showing themselves. I realized I was not just alone. I was being watched, perhaps for hours at a time, maybe even from within the forest itself. My mind raced with possibilities. Could be a hunter, maybe a group of people looking for a place to hide, or worse, someone who had noticed me when I arrived. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I forced myself to think rationally. I couldn't call anyone, the cabin had no signal. I couldn't see far into the forest. I had to rely on what I had, my awareness, my wits, and my preparation. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could, making it a secure stronghold and laying out small noise traps. Twigs arranged so that someone stepping through would make a sound. I had to know if anyone tried to come close. That night, the sounds outside grew more deliberate. I heard footsteps circling the cabin, sometimes near the windows, sometimes farther away, always moving in patterns that suggested awareness of my presence. I stayed as still and quiet as possible, holding my breath, listening. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but it was too quick to be certain. I realized that staying inside and waiting was dangerous. If someone wanted to trap me here, the cabin alone would not protect me indefinitely. Early the next morning, I made a plan. I gathered supplies, food, water, a map, and my backpack, and prepared to leave. My idea was to move quickly along the trail I had followed to get here, retracing my steps but staying alert. I knew the path would be risky, but staying put was more dangerous. I waited until dawn, when the light made it easier to see movement in the forest, and then I slipped out, keeping low, moving fast but quietly, my eyes scanning for any signs of the person or people who had been circling the cabin. The hike back to the car was tense beyond anything I had ever experienced. Every sound set my nerves on edge. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I moved in bursts, hiding behind trees and rocks whenever I thought I heard someone following. Hours passed in this state of hyper-awareness, until finally I saw a familiar sight, the rough dirt road that led to my car. Relief flooded me, but I did not slow down. I ran the last few hundred meters, jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced someone would emerge from the trees at any moment. The forest receded, the road widened, and eventually, I reached a town with signal and safety. I parked, called the authorities, and reported what had happened. The police came, checked the area, but found no one. No footprints, no signs of intruders, nothing. They suggested it could have been a misunderstanding, hikers or hunters passing through, but I knew what I had experienced. The fear, the presence, the feeling of being watched, it had been real. In the days that followed, I reflected on the experience. I realized how unprepared I had been for human danger in such a remote area, even when I had anticipated the wilderness itself. I understood the importance of having a way to communicate, even in isolation, and the need for a solid plan for every possible risk. I never returned to that cabin, but I learned valuable lessons. Trust your instincts, respect your environment, and prepare for more than just the natural dangers. The forest was not kind, and people could be unpredictable and dangerous, even in the most remote places. Looking back, The experience left me shaken but stronger. I survived because I stayed alert, planned carefully, and took decisive action when fear became imminent danger. I never felt alone in nature again, but I never lost my appreciation for it either. That cabin, deep in the mountains, remained etched in my memory as a place where the forest itself was not the scariest part. The unknown human presence was. And surviving that taught me more than any training, guidebook, or preparation ever could. I had been planning the trip for months, convinced I needed a break from everything that had been pressing on me. The constant noise of the city, the endless emails, the never-ending obligations. The cabin I rented was far away, tucked deep in the mountains, beyond cell reception, beyond any sign of immediate help. I wanted isolation, and this place promised it in full. It wasn't fancy, just a wooden structure with a stone chimney, a porch, and a small lake visible from the back window. The pictures online made it look quaint, cozy, and perfectly peaceful. I didn't know at the time just how wrong that perception would be. The drive there was long, winding through narrow, twisting roads lined with towering pines. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, spilling a golden light over the ridges of the mountains. The air was crisp, carrying that sharp, cold scent of pine and wet soil. I parked on a gravel path that led up to the cabin and unloaded my small SUV. The weight of my bag, my supplies, and the anticipation in my chest made my steps heavier than usual. I didn't think much of it at first. I was thrilled to be alone in nature. The cabin itself was modest. It had a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a loft above that I assumed was meant for sleeping. The walls were wooden planks, darkened with age, and the windows had thick glass that looked slightly warped. There was a creaking of the floorboards under my weight as I explored, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet surroundings. I unpacked slowly, placing food in the tiny refrigerator, stacking firewood near the fireplace, and organizing my things. The sun was almost gone by the time I lit the first fire. The smell of burning wood filled the room, comforting in a way I hadn't expected. I settled into the quiet, convinced I'd made the right choice. Night came quickly. With no artificial light around, the darkness outside the windows was complete. I could see the faint shimmer of the lake reflecting the moonlight, but beyond that, everything was black. The wind rustled the trees, and small branches tapped against the windows. I reminded myself that I was alone, that there was nothing to fear. But as the night grew deeper, the forest seemed to stretch further and become more alive in its silence. The first incident was subtle. I woke up to a noise, a soft scraping from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal. The forest was full of them, and the sound of claws or hooves brushing against wood wasn't unusual. I listened, holding my breath, trying to identify the source. It stopped, then began again on the other side of the cabin. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. I checked the locks, reassured myself, and eventually fell back asleep, though the sense of unease lingered. The next day, I explored the surrounding area. The trail to the lake was muddy from a recent rain. I walked carefully, taking in the beauty of the mountains, the stillness of the forest, and the way the sunlight pierced through the thick canopy of trees. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed that something was off. A small pile of sticks I had stacked near the porch was disturbed. Not completely, but slightly shifted, as if someone or something had brushed against it. I felt a chill and looked around. There was no one in sight, no footprints in the wet soil, nothing to indicate human presence. I convinced myself again it was just an animal, but the thought stuck. That night, the wind picked up. It wasn't the gentle rustle of earlier, but a low, sustained howl that pressed against the cabin walls. The fire flickered, shadows dancing across the ceiling. I tried to sleep, but the sounds outside were different now. Scraping, tapping, like something was moving along the edges of the cabin. My rational mind screamed that it was a branch or some loose shutter, but the rhythm didn't match the wind. It felt deliberate, slow, methodical. I kept my eyes on the windows, straining to see through the darkness. Nothing appeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I went outside early, intending to calm my nerves with fresh air. The ground was soft and muddy, and I followed the trail down to the lake. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were large, human-sized, and unlike any animal I'd seen before. They circled the cabin, but their origin was unclear. They weren't on the main path to the road, and they didn't lead away clearly. I froze, staring at them, a knot forming in my stomach. They were fresh. The mud hadn't hardened yet, and the impressions were deep. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest town was over an hour away, and I didn't have a clear path through the forest to get there without walking in circles. I returned to the cabin, heart pounding, trying to rationalize it again. Perhaps a hunter had been nearby, but no vehicles, no sounds, nothing suggested another human presence until then. I had been planning the trip for months, carefully selecting a cabin far off the beaten path, deep in the northern woods where the trees were thick and the nearest town was over 2 hours away. I needed solitude, a real escape from the endless city noise and the demands of work, and I thought the isolation would be refreshing. The cabin itself was small, built from rough-hewn logs, with a steep metal roof and a stone chimney. It sat on the edge of a clearing surrounded by towering pines, and the only road leading to it was an unpaved trail that quickly disappeared into the dense forest. I remember driving along that narrow path, the tires crunching over gravel and mud, feeling a strange sense of both excitement and unease. The sun was already low when I arrived, casting long shadows between the trees, and I realized immediately that once it set completely, I would be utterly alone. The cabin was rustic but well-maintained. The wooden porch creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. Dust lay thick in corners, but the main space was surprisingly clean. A small wood stove sat in one corner, and next to it was a stack of split logs. The cabin had a single bedroom, a tiny bathroom with a shower, and a living area that doubled as a kitchen, with a small sink and a gas stove. The windows were old, with slightly warped glass that distorted the view outside, making the forest seem even more endless and thick. I set my backpack down and began unpacking, carefully arranging supplies. Food, water, a first aid kit, and my flashlight with extra batteries. I wanted to be ready for anything, though I hadn't fully considered what that anything might be. As the daylight faded, I started a fire in the stove. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, mingling with the earthy scent of the forest that seeped in through cracks in the walls. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the pines and rattling the roof. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. I moved closer to the window, watching the shadows lengthen and the first hints of darkness settle over the clearing. There was no moon yet, and the sky above the treetops was a deep, almost black blue. I knew that in total darkness, the forest would feel like it had a weight of its own, pressing in on the cabin from all sides. After a simple dinner, I settled into the bedroom with a book, trying to focus on the words, but my attention kept drifting to the sounds outside. There were occasional creaks and groans of trees swaying in the wind, the distant call of a bird settling in for the night, and sometimes the subtle rustle of small animals moving through underbrush. At first, it was calming, a reminder that life still thrived in the forest. But as the night deepened, the sounds became sharper, more insistent, almost like they were aware of me. I shook off the thought and tried to focus on reading, but my eyes kept flicking to the window, to the thick darkness outside. Sleep was difficult to come by. Every crack in the floorboards, every sigh of the wind, every snap of a branch made me tense. Around 2 in the morning, a noise outside made my stomach drop. A heavy, dragging sound, like something large was moving across the ground, careful but deliberate. I held my breath and listened, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The noise stopped suddenly, replaced by a silence so intense it was almost tangible. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear, moving through the underbrush, but the dragging sound had been different from anything I had heard before. There was weight to it, like something had legs, but also like it was handling something. I couldn't sleep anymore, so I got up and walked to the window. Peering out, I strained to see through the blackness. My flashlight sat on the table, just out of reach, and I debated getting it, but then I froze. A shape had moved across the clearing, low to the ground and quick, almost too fast for my eyes to follow. It stopped near the tree-line, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then there was a sound, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves, and I realized I had not. Something or someone was out there. Panic set in, but I tried to stay calm. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it into the darkness, sweeping the beam slowly across the clearing. Nothing. The forest seemed empty, but my instincts screamed at me to move, to leave, to get somewhere safe. I considered driving back down the trail, but it was pitch black, and the thought of navigating that narrow path in the dark filled me with dread. I decided to lock the cabin door and barricade it with a chair, then move the remaining logs of firewood in front of the entrance, hoping to create some kind of deterrent. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the chair. Hours passed. Every rustle outside, every distant snap, made me freeze and hold my breath. I tried to tell myself it was wildlife, but a part of me knew it wasn't. The sounds had patterns, deliberate patterns, too organized to be random. There was something circling the cabin, sometimes close, sometimes retreating. I could hear the faint scrape of something against the walls, and once, I thought I heard a faint thud on the roof, like a heavy footstep landing on the metal. The realization that someone had been watching, waiting, filled me with a cold, suffocating fear. Morning came slowly. Light filtered through the warped glass of the windows, and with it came a fragile sense of relief. The forest looked normal in daylight, but I didn't feel safe. I checked the perimeter carefully, walking around the cabin, looking for footprints, tire tracks, or any sign of intrusion. There were footprints, large, heavy prints in the soft mud around the clearing, circling the cabin. They stopped at the edge of the forest and disappeared into the trees. Whoever or whatever had been out there had left in the night. I felt a grim sense of luck, but I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things quickly, making sure nothing was left behind that could be of use to anyone else. Driving down the narrow trail, I kept my eyes peeled on the forest. Every shadow made me tense, and every snap of a branch made me flinch. I didn't stop for anything until I reached the main road. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. The town was still a long drive away, but the presence of other people, the normality of the road signs and streetlights, gave me a sense of safety I hadn't felt in the previous hours. When I returned home, I contacted the local authorities and reported the footprints and the suspicious presence at the cabin. They said they would check it out, but it had already been disturbed, likely by someone using it as a temporary hideout. I learned later that the area had a history of break-ins, mostly by people looking for secluded places to stay temporarily or to stash stolen goods. It wasn't anything supernatural, nothing from a storybook. It was just human, and for some reason, the thought of someone out there, circling the cabin in the dead of night, filled me with far more fear than any ghost ever could. In the following weeks, I struggled to shake the memories. Every creak, every gust of wind, every shadow in my apartment reminded me of that night. But I also learned something important about preparedness, vigilance, and respect for isolation. I realized that the forest was not inherently threatening. It was neutral. The danger came from the unpredictable, often hidden presence of other humans, and that knowledge stayed with me, reshaping the way I approached solitude and wilderness trips. I never returned to that cabin, but I did return to the forest in safer, more controlled circumstances. I made sure to check in regularly to know exactly where I was, and to always have an escape plan. Looking back, I understand now that the fear I felt was real, and it was necessary. It reminded me how vulnerable we are when alone, and how careful we must be in environments that seem beautiful and tranquil on the surface, but can conceal real danger. The experience changed me, made me more alert, more aware, and ultimately, more respectful of both nature and the unpredictable actions of other people. I did not let it break me, but I also did not underestimate it. The cabin, the forest, and the person or people who had been there that night became a permanent lesson in the fragile balance between isolation and safety, solitude and vigilance. By the third night, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I couldn't shake it, no matter how I tried. Every shadow seemed to move in unnatural ways. Every small sound sounded amplified and threatening. I made sure my flashlight and extra batteries were within reach, kept a heavy metal pipe beside the door, and stayed close to the fireplace for warmth and light. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, and I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Sleep was impossible. I spent hours crouched near the fire, listening. I thought I heard voices once, muffled, distant, but when I strained to focus, there was only silence. On the fourth day, I decided I could not stay passive anymore. I needed to understand what was happening, to know if I was in danger from another human. I spent the morning quietly scouting the perimeter of the cabin, moving slowly, watching for any signs of someone nearby. That's when I noticed something chilling. There were more footprints, some leading away from the cabin and some returning. They circled around the building, as if whoever had made them was observing me without showing themselves. I realized I was not just alone. I was being watched, perhaps for hours at a time, maybe even from within the forest itself. My mind raced with possibilities. Could be a hunter, maybe a group of people looking for a place to hide, or worse, someone who had noticed me when I arrived. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I forced myself to think rationally. I couldn't call anyone, the cabin had no signal. I couldn't see far into the forest. I had to rely on what I had, my awareness, my wits, and my preparation. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could, making it a secure stronghold and laying out small noise traps. Twigs arranged so that someone stepping through would make a sound. I had to know if anyone tried to come close. That night, the sounds outside grew more deliberate. I heard footsteps circling the cabin, sometimes near the windows, sometimes farther away, always moving in patterns that suggested awareness of my presence. I stayed as still and quiet as possible, holding my breath, listening. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but it was too quick to be certain. I realized that staying inside and waiting was dangerous. If someone wanted to trap me here, the cabin alone would not protect me indefinitely. Early the next morning, I made a plan. I gathered supplies, food, water, a map, and my backpack, and prepared to leave. My idea was to move quickly along the trail I had followed to get here, retracing my steps but staying alert. I knew the path would be risky, but staying put was more dangerous. I waited until dawn, when the light made it easier to see movement in the forest, and then I slipped out, keeping low, moving fast but quietly, my eyes scanning for any signs of the person or people who had been circling the cabin. The hike back to the car was tense beyond anything I had ever experienced. Every sound set my nerves on edge. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I moved in bursts, hiding behind trees and rocks whenever I thought I heard someone following. Hours passed in this state of hyper-awareness, until finally I saw a familiar sight, the rough dirt road that led to my car. Relief flooded me, but I did not slow down. I ran the last few hundred meters, jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced someone would emerge from the trees at any moment. The forest receded, the road widened, and eventually, I reached a town with signal and safety. I parked, called the authorities, and reported what had happened. The police came, checked the area, but found no one. No footprints, no signs of intruders, nothing. They suggested it could have been a misunderstanding, hikers or hunters passing through, but I knew what I had experienced. The fear, the presence, the feeling of being watched, it had been real. In the days that followed, I reflected on the experience. I realized how unprepared I had been for human danger in such a remote area, even when I had anticipated the wilderness itself. I understood the importance of having a way to communicate, even in isolation, and the need for a solid plan for every possible risk. I never returned to that cabin, but I learned valuable lessons. Trust your instincts, respect your environment, and prepare for more than just the natural dangers. The forest was not kind, and people could be unpredictable and dangerous, even in the most remote places. Looking back, the experience left me shaken but stronger. I survived because I stayed alert, planned planned carefully, and took decisive action when fear became imminent danger. I never felt alone in nature again, but I never lost my appreciation for it either. That cabin, deep in the mountains, remained etched in my memory as a place where the forest itself was not the scariest part. The unknown human presence was. And surviving that taught me more than any training, guidebook, or preparation ever could. It was early autumn when I decided to rent a small cabin in the mountains. I had been looking for a quiet place to escape from the city, a place where I could be alone, think, and just live simply for a few days. The listing said it was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, with a small river nearby. From the photos, it looked cozy, made of aged wood, with a stone chimney and a small porch. I thought the isolation would be comforting, the quiet a relief from the constant noise and people in the city. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low between the trees, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. The drive had been bumpy. The last few miles were filled with potholes and deep ruts, and I was glad I had a small SUV with decent ground clearance. The forest pressed close on either side, tall pines and oaks that bent over the road, letting through thin streaks of sunlight. I felt a chill, not from the air but from the total silence. No cars, no birds. Not even the wind moving the leaves seemed loud enough to break it. The cabin was exactly as pictured, maybe even more solid and older than I expected. The wood was weathered, gray in parts, but sturdy. The roof had a slight sag in the middle, and the chimney looked like it had not been swept recently, judging by the soot stains running down the stone. The porch floor creaked under my boots as I unloaded my bag. I had planned to stay for a week, and I carried food, water, and firewood, along with a small first aid kit and my laptop. I had been careful. I had told no one exactly where I was going, and I had checked in briefly with a friend before leaving, giving them an approximate return date. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old smoke. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table with a couple of chairs, a small couch, and a twin bed in the corner with clean but heavy blankets. There was a wood stove, its flue connected to the chimney, and a small pile of firewood stacked beside it. I set my things down and walked to the window. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly. The river was not visible from the cabin, but I could hear its faint murmur somewhere beyond the trees. The first night passed quietly, the only sounds the occasional hoot of an owl and the creaking of the cabin settling in the cold night air. I slept heavily, the kind of deep, undisturbed sleep city life rarely allows. I woke the next morning to sunlight filtering through the trees, the cabin warm from the sun's early rays. I decided to explore the surroundings, wanting to see the river and the forest paths I could follow. The forest was thick, dense with underbrush and fallen leaves. The ground was soft, covered in moss in places, with roots and rocks hidden just beneath the surface. I moved carefully, wanting to avoid twisting an ankle or disturbing any wildlife. The air was damp but fresh, carrying the smell of wet earth, decaying leaves, and pine. I followed the faint sound of the river, navigating through the trees until I reached a narrow, shallow stream. The water ran cold and clear, tumbling over smooth stones. I knelt to splash water on my face, watching small fish dart under the surface. It felt peaceful, the kind of serenity that city streets and noise could never provide. Returning to the cabin, I started a fire in the stove, enjoying the warmth and the smell of burning wood. I prepared a simple meal, canned beans and bread, and settled into the couch with a book. The isolation was heavier than I had expected, not frightening, just absolute. No sounds of human activity anywhere. It made me aware of every noise I did hear. The faint rustle of leaves, the distant rush of the river, the groan of the cabin under its own weight. The second day, I decided to explore a little further. I wanted to find a higher vantage point to look over the forest, maybe see the mountains in the distance. The forest floor became rougher, the terrain steeper, roots and rocks making every step uncertain. I found a small ridge and climbed to its top, breathless, my heart beating faster than from the exertion alone. From the ridge, I could see treetops stretching endlessly, a green sea broken only by occasional rock outcrops. There was no sign of other humans. No patas, no cabins, no liter, just forest. The isolation felt both freeing and uneasy. When I returned, I realized the day had passed faster than I expected. The sun was low again, casting long shadows that made the forest seem denser, more closed in. I lit the fire again, feeling its warmth on my face. I was aware of how quickly darkness fell here, how soon the forest could conceal everything beyond a few feet. I reminded myself to stay inside after dark, even though nothing had happened to suggest danger. The third day was when things began to feel off. I had gone to the river early, planning to fish. I had brought a small fishing rod and some basic tackle, hoping to catch something simple for dinner. The water was shallow, but I could see fish swimming just beneath the surface. As I cast my line, I noticed something strange. Footprints along the muddy bank. They were large, like a human's, but the depth and spacing were odd, heavier than a person my size. I felt a pang of anxiety, but rationalized it. Perhaps hunters had passed through recently, or someone else staying in the forest. Still, the thought lingered. I returned to the cabin cautiously, scanning the trees as I walked. The path back seemed longer, shadows darker. When I arrived, I checked the perimeter of the cabin, walking the edges slowly. Nothing appeared out of place. No footprints near the porch, no signs of anyone having been close. I reassured myself that it was probably just my imagination, or old tracks that had become muddled in the rain and mud. That night, I slept fitfully. Every creak and pop of the cabin seemed louder, sharper. I woke to the sound of snapping twigs outside, distant at first, then closer. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and eventually drifted back to uneasy sleep. The next day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I collected firewood and prepared a larger stockpile, stacking it neatly beside the stove. I checked my supplies, making sure I had enough food and water for several days, just in case. While chopping wood, I noticed something else. A faint trail leading into the forest from the edge of the clearing. It was narrow, barely noticeable, but it was there. I couldn't see how long it went or where it led. I felt my stomach tighten. Part of me wanted to follow it, to understand if someone had been nearby, but I resisted. I did not want to leave the safety of the open area around the cabin. That night, I slept fitfully. Every creak and pop of the cabin seemed louder, sharper. I woke to the sound of snapping twigs outside, distant at first, then closer. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and eventually drifted back to uneasy sleep. The next day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I collected firewood and prepared a larger stockpile, stacking it neatly beside the stove. I checked my supplies, making sure I had enough food and water for several days, just in case. While chopping wood, I noticed something else. A faint trail leading into the forest from the edge of the clearing. It was narrow, barely noticeable, but it was there. I couldn't see how long it went or where it led. I felt my stomach tighten. Part of me wanted to follow it, to understand if someone had been nearby, but I resisted. I did not want to leave the safety of the open area around the cabin. That night, the sounds became harder to ignore. I was sitting near the fire when I heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, slow steps, not like an animal. My heart pounded. I grabbed a long branch I had cut earlier and held it tightly. The steps stopped. Silence. I strained my ears. Then, a soft scratching, as if someone had pressed their fingers against the door or the wood siding. I did not move, did not breathe. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began. I did not sleep that night. I kept the fire burning, moving the branch within reach. The following morning, I found evidence of someone, or something, having been near the cabin. The dirt near the porch was disturbed, fresh footprints partially hidden by fallen leaves. They were large, uneven, almost like they were dragging one foot. I checked the perimeter again. No signs of forced entry, no marks on the windows or door. I felt a cold certainty that someone had been there, watching, maybe even lingering close by the night before. I spent the next day preparing. I moved some furniture to block the door and windows, double-checked locks, and created a makeshift alarm system. Small tin cans tied with string around the perimeter, hoping the noise would alert me if anyone approached. I also gathered more firewood so I could stay inside if needed. Every sound outside set my nerves on edge. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, the river's murmur. I could not relax. The forest had become threatening in a way it had not been before. The fourth night, I was ready. I stayed awake, fire blazing, listening to the forest. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, deliberate, circling the cabin. Then, a loud thud against the door. I raised my branch, bracing for someone to break in. Another thud, then silence. I waited, heart racing, sweat on my brow, listening. The footsteps returned, moving away from the door, around the cabin's edge, then fading into the distance. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the dark forest, waiting for a sign of movement. When morning came, I cautiously stepped outside. There were footprints, as before, now clearly human. They circled the cabin, stopped at the windows, then led back into the trees. Whoever had been there was gone. I felt a mixture of fear and relief. I packed a small bag, deciding to leave immediately. I did not wait to check the trail or explore further. The forest, which had felt peaceful only a few days ago, now seemed alive with unseen eyes. I drove away slowly, glancing into the rearview mirror at the cabin disappearing among the trees. Every branch, every shadow seemed ominous, like it could conceal someone watching. I did not stop until I reached the main road, the safety of traffic and people reassuring. That experience stayed with me long after I returned to the city. I thought about the isolation, the ease with which someone could approach unnoticed, and how quickly solitude can turn to vulnerability. I realized how much we rely on other people's presence, even indirectly, for a sense of security. The forest had not been dangerous in itself, but it had been a perfect hiding place for someone with ill intent. In the following weeks, I researched the area. I learned that some people, though rarely, did trespass in those woods, sometimes to hunt illegally, sometimes for other reasons. The authorities confirmed there were occasional reports of cabins being approached or broken into, though crimes were infrequent. That knowledge, while disturbing, gave me closure. I understood that what I had experienced was not a random nightmare or a story. It was real, grounded in human behavior. I never returned to that cabin. I avoided the area entirely, but I kept the skills and lessons it taught me. The importance of situational awareness, of preparing for the unexpected, of respecting isolation as something that can be both beautiful and dangerous. I learned to trust my instincts, to listen to what the environment tells me, and to act decisively when something felt wrong. The fear I felt that week has faded, replaced by a quiet awareness. I understand now that danger is not always dramatic or immediate. It can be subtle, creeping in the form of footprints in the dirt, the sound of movement just beyond vision, the realization that you are being watched without knowing why. What matters is how you respond. Carefully, calmly, and with determination to protect yourself. Looking back, the cabin was not cursed, not haunted, not mysterious. It was simply a place that forced me to confront the limits of solitude and safety. The ending, though frightening at the time, was clear. I survived, I learned, and I acted. I left with my life, my health, and my sense of awareness intact. The cabin itself remains in the forest, empty and silent, a reminder of the tension between isolation and vulnerability, a lesson in the realities of the human world. I had been planning this trip for months, hoping for a quiet break from the constant pressure of work and the city's noise. I had found a small cabin for rent in a remote area several hours' drive away, tucked in a dense forest that seemed almost untouched. The pictures online made it look perfect. Weathered wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and large windows that opened onto a view of tall pines and a small creek running nearby. I wanted isolation, a chance to unplug entirely, and at first, the idea of being alone in the woods felt freeing. I did not expect that it would become one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The drive was long. The GPS lost signal about an hour outside the nearest small town, and after that, I was navigating on a narrow, winding dirt road with steep drops on one side and thick trees pressing in on the other. The sun was low in the sky, orange and heavy, and the forest shadows grew long and dark as I drove. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a surge of relief. It was small but solid, with a tin roof and a porch that overlooked the creek. The air smelled of damp pine and moss. I parked my car and took a moment to just breathe in the quiet, the kind of quiet you only find far from civilization. Inside, the cabin was rustic but comfortable. The floorboards creaked when I walked, and there was a faint smell of wood smoke and old fabric. The fireplace had a small pile of wood stacked beside it, and the kitchen had the basics: a stove, a small fridge, and a few pots and pans. I unpacked my bag and walked through the rooms, opening windows to let the forest air in. It was peaceful in a way I had not felt in years. I made a fire in the fireplace as night fell, stacked extra wood close by, and settled in with a notebook, intending to write and relax. That night, the first sense of unease came not from any sound but from a feeling. I could not explain it, just a faint prickling along the back of my neck as I sat by the fire. The wind rustled through the trees outside, and the shadows seemed to move in ways that felt deliberate, though I knew that was impossible. I forced myself to shake it off, blaming exhaustion and the strange quiet. I went to bed, leaving a small light on in the corner of the room, and tried to sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. At first, it was soft, almost like a footstep on the wooden porch outside. Then there was another, slower, heavier, deliberate. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The cabin was supposed to be completely isolated. There was no road nearby, no other houses, nothing. The sound came again, a single thump against the outer wall of the cabin, then silence. I sat up, trying to think logically. Maybe it was a branch or an animal brushing against the cabin. But the thump had been solid, heavier than any animal could make. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the window, pressing my face against the glass. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and I could see the creek reflecting the faint moonlight. Nothing. My rational brain told me it had been nothing, and I tried to lie back down. But I could not sleep. Morning brought a false sense of safety. I went outside, circling the cabin to see if there were any signs of disturbance. Nothing looked out of place, except for one set of footprints in the soft dirt of the porch. They were human-sized, running from the edge of the forest to the cabin and then back again. But the strange thing was that the footprints were fresh. They had to be from the night, and there was no road or path leading to the cabin. The nearest trail was more than a mile away through dense forest. Whoever had made those prints had come through the trees. I debated leaving immediately, but I had driven hours to get here, and I did not want to abandon the trip entirely. I decided to stay, but I secured the doors and windows, checked the locks repeatedly, and kept my phone close. Even so, the sense of being watched stayed with me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my pulse spike. Over the next day, the feeling of unease escalated. I explored the nearby woods, but only in daylight. I tried to reassure myself by noting that it was a remote area, wildlife was common, and I was probably imagining threats in my tired state. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I found something unsettling. Small objects I had left on the porch, my water bottle, a pair of gloves, had been moved slightly, as though someone had touched them and then replaced them. Nothing else was missing, nothing was broken, but the deliberate nature of the movement chilled me. That evening, I built a larger fire in the fireplace, trying to convince myself I was safe. I ate a simple dinner, double-checking every lock on the doors and windows before settling in for the night. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and careful, moving around the cabin. This time, they did not stop at the porch. They moved along the side of the cabin, around the back, and then paused, almost as if the person had stopped to look through a window. I grabbed the flashlight and a kitchen knife, creeping to the window. I pressed my face to the glass, trying to see anything in the blackness outside. My breath fogged up the pain, and then I saw it. A shadowy figure moving slowly through the trees, keeping just out of clear sight. My pulse thumped in my ears. It was impossible to tell anything specific, but I knew it was human. I went back to the fire, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The figure never made a sound, never came closer than the edge of the trees, but it stayed there, visible in the faint moonlight, for hours. The next morning, I called the local sheriff from my phone while it still had signal. I explained what I had seen, and he sounded concerned. He told me that this part of the forest was sometimes used by people for illegal activities, and that I should leave immediately and not approach anyone alone. I packed my things quickly, every sense on high alert, constantly checking the edges of the forest. As I loaded my car, I saw movement in the trees again, a figure standing just out of the tree line, watching me. I did not hesitate. I got into the car, locked the doors, and drove off as fast as I could while keeping control on the dirt road. I glanced in the rearview mirror constantly as I drove. The figure did not follow at first, but about a mile down the road, I caught sight of movement along the edge of the forest, tracking me from a distance. I drove faster, my heart racing. The road twisted and turned, the trees pressing close, and I realized that if the figure wanted to follow me, there was nothing stopping them from vanishing into the woods and reappearing elsewhere. I kept driving, hoping to reach the main road before anything happened. Eventually, I reached a small town, stopped at a gas station, and called the sheriff again. They dispatched officers to check the area near the cabin. I never went back. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin had been previously occupied by squatters who had been using it as a hideout for minor criminal activity. The footsteps and watching I had experienced were likely someone keeping an eye on the property, suspicious of any new visitors. The relief I felt was overwhelming, knowing I had not imagined everything but that the threat had been real and human. Even months later, though, I cannot shake the memory. Driving into that forest, the isolation, the darkness, the sound of footsteps and a shadow in the trees. Those moments stayed with me. I never returned to that area, and I always checked the perimeter and surroundings when staying in cabins or any remote locations. I learned the hard way that the woods are not always peaceful, and sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters but other people, and the knowledge that in the deep, quiet forest, they can watch you without you seeing them at all. On the fourth night, the sense of unease escalated. I had been sitting near the fire, reading an old, weathered book I had brought along. The forest was silent for the first time in days, the usual sounds of animals and wind absent. Then I heard a different sound, unmistakable and deliberate. A knock on the cabin door. My heart stopped. The door had a simple wooden latch, and I hadn't locked it. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the sound. Could it have been a falling branch? The pattern was too rhythmic, too controlled. Someone or something was outside. I didn't have a weapon beyond a small hatchet I carried for chopping firewood, but I gripped it anyway, my knuckles white. I waited, straining my ears. The knocking didn't repeat immediately. I thought I heard movement around the perimeter, a shuffle that circled the cabin. I climbed into the loft, hoping that being above would make me feel safer, and tried to calm my racing heart. I listened for hours, the hatchet held tightly in my hands. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I dozed in short bursts, waking at every small noise. The night seemed endless. The following morning, I checked the perimeter of the cabin. There were footprints in the dirt around the clearing, larger than mine, human-shaped, though it was difficult to tell exactly. They were not fresh. They had been partially scuffed by the wind and falling leaves, but their presence confirmed what I had feared. Someone had been near the cabin. I checked the doors and windows. All were intact, nothing was missing, but the knowledge that someone had been here was enough to make me uneasy. I realized that the cabin, remote though it was, could not guarantee my safety. Over the next day, I debated whether to leave. The nearest town was miles away, and my car was still parked by the cabin. If someone wanted to confront me, I would have no escape. I reinforced the doors with extra logs and moved furniture to block the windows, trying to create a sense of security. I kept the hatchet nearby at all times. That night, I stayed awake, watching the darkened forest, listening for any sounds. There were none, at least for the first few hours. Then, around midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I gripped the hatchet and waited, heart pounding, every instinct on edge. The steps stopped near the door, and I held my breath. Then silence. I didn't dare move until sunrise. By the morning, I had made a decision. I would leave the cabin no matter what. The safety I thought I had sought in isolation was an illusion. There was no sense of adventure in risking my life. I packed my belongings quickly but carefully, moving quietly in case anyone was outside. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing to suggest life beyond the occasional snapping twig. I reached my car, sliding in and locking the doors. The drive back was tense, every shadow along the road making me flinch. The dirt roads felt longer, the forest more suffocating. I kept the windows rolled up and the doors locked until I reached the first paved road. Back in the city, the memory of the cabin lingered. I told myself I had escaped without incident, but I knew that if the person or people who had been near the cabin had wanted to, they could have done something. I had been lucky, or maybe cautious enough to avoid confrontation. Either way, the experience changed me. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was also dangerous in ways I hadn't anticipated. Isolation wasn't freedom, it was vulnerability. And in that cabin, alone in the dark, I had confronted the reality of being utterly exposed. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin, but only to take pictures from the road and confirm it was still standing. I never went inside again. I realized that my desire for solitude had been naive, romanticized by ideas of peace and nature. True solitude, unprotected and unobserved, carries risks I was no longer willing to take. The cabin remained in my memory, not as a place of relaxation, but as a place of tension, fear, and awareness. And though I never returned, I carried with me the lessons of those days. Respect for the wilderness, for isolation, and for the fact that danger can appear in unexpected forms, often silent, often unseen, and always close when you least expect it. Over time, I found other ways to connect with nature: day hikes, short trips, camping near populated areas, methods that allowed solitude but also a measure of safety. The cabin trip became a cautionary tale in my mind, a story I could recount with a strange pride for having survived, and a deeper appreciation for the small comforts of safety. The fear, once overwhelming, became a reminder of my own judgment and the limits of human control in the wild. In the end, I understood something crucial. Nature itself was not inherently frightening, nor were its creatures, nor even the isolation. What was frightening was the unknown, the hidden human presence that could exploit vulnerability. And by facing it, by returning to safety and reflecting on the experience, I had gained clarity and respect. I was not broken by fear. I was wiser. The cabin, its shadowed forest, the sounds at night, all of it remained etched in my memory, a testament to the careful balance between curiosity and caution, adventure and prudence. And in that balance, I found peace. I had been planning the trip for months, mostly in my head, imagining the solitude and the silence of the forest cabin. The idea of being completely cut off from the world was appealing. My life in the city had become too loud, too crowded, too fast, and the thought of escaping into a dense forest for a week was irresistible. I left the city on a Friday morning, my car packed with supplies. Enough food to last a week, water, a small first aid kit, extra clothes, and a stack of firewood. I also brought a portable stove, but I had no intention of using it much, preferring the simplicity of a wood-burning fireplace. The cabin was supposed to be primitive, lacking any electricity or running water, but that was exactly what I wanted. The drive itself was longer than I anticipated. The map I had studied weeks before seemed straightforward, but roads became less maintained the further I drove. Potholes appeared sporadically, Trees leaned dangerously close to the edges of the narrow asphalt, and the occasional deer darted across the road. At some point, the asphalt disappeared completely, replaced by a dirt road that wove between thick groves of pines. The forest was dense, casting shadows even though it was mid-afternoon. My car rattled and shook as I forced it over rocks and roots that jutted out of the dirt. Every so often, I would stop and check the map, trying to reassure myself that I wasn't lost, though the quiet gnawing sense of uncertainty lingered. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, and long shadows stretched across the clearing. The cabin was older than I expected, constructed from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to a dull gray. Moss grew in patches along the roof and around the corners, and the windows were clouded with dirt. Despite its rough exterior, the cabin had a certain charm. It looked like it had been standing there for decades, a lone structure in a forest that seemed endless. The surrounding area was overgrown with weeds and small saplings, the result of years without human intervention. A narrow path led from the cabin to a small stream nearby, its water glinting in the last rays of sunlight. I parked the car on a small patch of flat ground and climbed out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was sharp and cool, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. I unpacked my supplies and carried them into the cabin. Inside, the space was small, maybe 20 feet by 15, with a loft above that could serve as a sleeping area. The fireplace dominated one wall, surrounded by a simple stone hearth. There were a few pieces of worn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, and a cot pushed into the corner. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, but everything seemed solid. I set my supplies down, arranged the firewood neatly near the hearth, and started a small fire. As night fell, the forest around the cabin grew darker. The trees swayed in the wind, and their branches scratched against the walls with an eerie rhythm. I had anticipated some creaking and groaning from the old cabin, but the sounds were louder than I expected, echoing through the small structure. I ate a simple dinner, heating canned soup over the fire, and tried to settle in. There was no cell phone reception, no way to call for help if something went wrong. I felt a strange mixture of freedom and vulnerability, alone in the middle of nowhere. The first night was uneasy. I woke several times to the sounds of movement outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or animals, maybe raccoons or deer, but some of the noises didn't make sense. There were snaps of twigs, rustlings that seemed too deliberate, too close to the cabin to be mere chance. I told myself I was being paranoid. Forests were alive at night. It was natural to hear strange noises. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to explore the immediate area. The path to the stream was overgrown, and I had to push through thick brush to reach it. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I knelt and drank some, grateful for the refreshing taste, and filled my water bottle for later. As I walked along the stream, I noticed signs of wildlife. Tracks in the mud, small holes dug into the bank, and claw marks on some of the tree trunks. The forest seemed alive in a way I had not appreciated from the car. It was beautiful but also intimidating, a reminder that I was a visitor in a place ruled by forces I could not control. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I chopped firewood, fetched water from the stream, cooked simple meals, and explored nearby areas. I made a mental map of the surroundings, noting a small ridge to the east and a clearing to the north where the sun hit in the morning. Each night, I tried to sleep early to avoid wandering around in the dark. Yet each night, I was woken by noises outside, some of them unnervingly close. Sometimes it sounded like someone, or something, was walking along the edge of the clearing, circling the cabin. I never saw anything, but the repeated sounds left a pit of anxiety in my stomach. I had been driving all day, the highway stretching endlessly through forests so dense that the sun barely touched the road in places. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months, craving solitude, the kind where there was no one to hear your thoughts, no phone signal, and no deadlines hanging over you. The directions were simple enough. Turn off the main road onto a narrow gravel path, follow it for a few miles until it ended at a small clearing where the cabin stood. Maps barely marked it, and I liked that. I liked the idea that few people came here. When I finally turned onto the gravel path, my car bounced and rattled as loose stones hit the undercarriage. The trees pressed closer on either side, thick trunks with branches tangled high above, forming a canopy that made the afternoon feel like twilight. Occasionally, a deer would dart across the path, its body vanishing into the underbrush before I could even blink. The air smelled different here. Damp soil, pine needles, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. I told myself it was nothing, just the woods. The path seemed longer than it should have been. Every mile, I half expected the cabin to appear, but the road twisted and turned in ways that felt unnatural, almost deliberately confusing. The sun was beginning to sink by the time I finally saw it. A small wooden structure tucked between two hills, the roof sagging slightly, the walls darkened with age. It had a small porch, a single chimney, and two windows that reflected the fading light. The clearing around it was littered with fallen branches and dry leaves. I parked my car and got out, the gravel crunching under my boots, feeling the first true sense of isolation. The cabin itself smelled of damp wood and mildew. I ran my hands along the walls, feeling the rough texture, and opened the door. It creaked loudly, louder than I expected, echoing through the empty space inside. The interior was small but functional. A single room with a wood stove in one corner, a narrow kitchen area with a sink and a few cupboards, and a loft accessible by a rickety ladder. Dust covered every surface, except for the small pile of firewood stacked neatly near the stove. I noted that the windows were old, the glass fogged in places, and the locks were rusty. Still, it felt solid, safe enough for a weekend alone. I unpacked my things slowly, deliberately, setting my bag in the corner and spreading out the supplies I had brought. Food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, water, and a few books. I didn't plan to spend much time inside. I wanted to walk the surrounding woods, explore, and take notes on the wildlife. By the time I had settled in, the sun had gone, leaving a dim orange glow over the tree line. Shadows stretched long and thin, crawling across the floor. Night came quickly here. There were no streetlights, no distant cities to wash the sky with light. When I stepped outside, the stars were countless, pinpricks of white against a black velvet sky. The air was cold, sharper than I expected, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I walked around the clearing, letting my flashlight beam sweep across the trees, noting the shapes of the trunks, the undergrowth, the dark hollows where animals might hide. I started a fire in the stove, the first flames snapping and crackling, filling the cabin with warmth and a faint, comforting smell of burning wood. I sat on the floor beside it, watching the shadows dance along the walls. At first, I felt exhilarated, alone in the woods, surrounded by darkness and silence. But gradually, a creeping unease began to settle in, subtle but undeniable. Every sound seemed amplified. The rustle of leaves outside, the occasional thump of branches hitting the cabin roof, the scurrying of something small in the underbrush. Sleep came reluctantly. The bed in the loft was narrow and lumpy, but I climbed the ladder and tried to lie down. Every little noise startled me. The groan of the cabin settling, a distant snap of a branch, the flapping of wings somewhere beyond the windows. I closed my eyes, trying to remind myself that I was safe, that it was just the forest, that these sounds were normal. But the feeling that I was being watched lingered. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks because I was alone and tired. Around 2 in the morning, I woke with a start. There was a sound, faint but distinct, coming from outside the cabin. It wasn't a branch breaking, and it wasn't the usual rustle of animals. It was deliberate, something moving slowly, carefully, on the edge of the clearing. I froze, straining to hear. The darkness pressed in through the window, blacker than before, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. My flashlight was on the floor beside the bed, and I hesitated before picking it up, knowing that once I shone it outside, I might see something I couldn't unsee. I slowly lifted the beam and swept it across the clearing. Nothing. just shadows, trees, and the faint outline of the hill on the far side. My heart slowed, but the unease remained. I tried to sleep again, but the restlessness kept me awake, listening, imagining the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel or leaves. By dawn, I hadn't slept. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin and walk along the paths around the clearing. Fresh air, daylight, and movement might help calm my nerves. I packed a small bag with water and snacks, leaving the cabin door unlocked but visible from the clearing. The forest was alive with birds, squirrels, and other creatures. I followed a narrow deer trail that led deeper into the woods. The path wound tightly around trees, over roots, and through patches of thick brush. It was peaceful in a way, the sun piercing through the branches, the smell of damp earth, the sound of distant water flowing. On the third day, I went to the porch to assess the perimeter. That's when I saw it, tracks. Not animal tracks, but human. Bare footprints pressed into the dirt, leading from the tree-line to the porch, stopping just short of the steps. My stomach turned over. Someone had been here while I was inside. They could have looked in the windows. They could have waited. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin, nailing planks over weak spots, checking every window and door. That night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., I woke to heavy breathing outside. Someone was standing near the cabin, watching. I could hear it, deep and slow. I grabbed a flashlight and the knife, ready for whatever. I stayed as quiet as I could, listening, trying to figure out a plan. Then I remembered the car, my escape route. If I could get to the car, I could drive to town, call the police, get help. I waited, holding my breath. The figure didn't move. I inched toward the door, flashlight low, careful not to make a sound. Then, suddenly, they turned and disappeared into the forest. I didn't chase them. I knew better. I ran to the car, slamming the door, locking it. I sat inside for what felt like hours, shivering, trying to decide my next move. Finally, I started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the path. As I drove down the twisting road, I saw movement in the trees, shadows flitting away. I didn't look back. When I reached the main road, the relief hit me like a wave. I drove straight to the nearest town, parked, and called the police. They were professional but calm, taking my report seriously. They said someone had been reported as trespassing in the area recently, a local with a history of following hikers and campers. The cabin had been targeted before. I realized that all those footsteps, the scratching at the walls, the silent watching, it had been a person, not my imagination. The terror I had felt was real, grounded in reality. The police patrolled the area for the next few days. I didn't return to the cabin. Eventually, the trespasser was caught nearby, hiding in another abandoned cabin. He had been following hikers, waiting for the right moment, but no one had ever been hurt before. I felt a complicated mix of relief and lingering fear. I had survived, and the ending was clear. I had escaped, the threat had been neutralized, and I was safe. But the experience stayed with me. I learned to respect the isolation of the wilderness, to prepare for reality rather than fantasy, and to never underestimate the danger that can hide behind calm, quiet landscapes. Even months later, when I drive through the mountains or walk in the forest, I think of the cabin. I remember the feeling of being watched, the way the forest could close in on you, and the importance of being alert, aware, and ready. It taught me something essential. Fear is not always imaginary, and sometimes surviving simply means trusting your instincts, keeping calm, and acting decisively. That cabin experience changed me, made me more cautious, more careful, but it also gave me a sense of resilience. I survived something real, and I came out stronger. It started with the idea of escaping the city for a few days. I had been stuck in a small apartment for weeks, the walls closing in on me, and the constant noise of traffic, people, and the endless hum of life had begun to wear me down. I wanted silence, isolation, a place where the only sounds were the wind and the rustle of leaves. I remembered seeing an old cabin listed online, far out in the woods, miles away from anything that resembled civilization. It was rustic, small, and had a certain charm that drew me in immediately. I booked it for a long weekend, thinking it would be the perfect escape. The drive out was longer than I expected. The highways ended abruptly, replaced by gravel roads that twisted through dense forests. I watched as the trees grew closer together, their branches interlacing to form dark tunnels overhead. The sky dimmed under the thick canopy, and I felt a quiet unease creep over me. But I brushed it aside, telling myself that this was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, peace, and a break from reality. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, and when I finally arrived, the small clearing it sat in seemed untouched for decades. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, sharp and clean, and for a moment, I felt a deep sense of relief. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. It was built from thick logs, with a steep roof and a stone chimney. A thin layer of moss covered parts of the roof, and the windows were dusty, streaked from years of rain. Inside, it was cramped with a small living area, a wood stove, a narrow kitchen, and a lofted bedroom. The floor creaked under every step, and the furniture was basic and worn. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough. I unpacked my things, laid out a few essentials, and lit a fire in the stove. The warmth and the crackling sound were comforting, the first sign of life in the stillness around me. The first day passed quietly. I explored the surrounding woods, taking in the stillness, the way the sunlight dappled the forest floor. Birds called out now and then, and I noticed small tracks in the dirt. Rabbits, squirrels, maybe a deer. It felt like the perfect retreat. I cooked a simple dinner, sat by the fire, and felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in months. The isolation wasn't scary yet. It felt safe, almost sacred. As evening fell, I settled in for the night. The cabin grew colder than I expected, and I had to stoke the fire repeatedly. Outside, the woods were dark, and the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows and sending small branches skittering across the roof. I told myself it was just the wind, nothing more, but a small knot of unease started to form in my stomach. I went to bed early, thinking that a good night's sleep would shake the feeling. Night in the cabin was different from the city. The sounds were sharper, clearer, almost magnified. The creaks of the cabin settling, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. It all felt heightened in the darkness. Around midnight, I was awoken by a sound outside, faint at first, then growing louder. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, pacing back and forth near the edge of the clearing. My heart jumped. I stayed frozen, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, circling the cabin. I rationalized it, maybe an animal, maybe the wind moving branches across rocks. But the rhythm was too intentional, too steady for an animal. I felt my chest tighten. I considered waking up fully, checking the door, but I froze, imagining the possibility of someone actually being out there. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that I had been cooped up too long, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. Hours passed. I kept the fire going, each crackle making me jump. When dawn finally came, it revealed nothing. The clearing was empty, untouched. I breathed a deep sigh of relief, telling myself it was probably a dream or an animal I hadn't seen. I spent the day keeping busy, chopping wood for the stove, exploring more of the surrounding forest, and taking photographs of the quiet, serene landscape. The unease hadn't vanished, but I could convince myself it was just nerves. I told myself I had survived the night, and that was proof enough that I could handle a few more. The second night was worse. I was cooking dinner when I heard it. A low, scraping sound coming from outside, like something dragging along the ground. I froze mid-step, listening. The sound stopped suddenly, then started again, closer this time. I went to the window and looked out, straining to see anything in the dim light. The forest seemed still, empty, but the sound continued, circling the cabin, echoing off the trees. My mind raced. Could it be someone trying to get in? I had locked the doors, checked the windows, everything seemed secure. And yet, the noise persisted, slow and deliberate, Never random like an animal, always methodical. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the kitchen counter and crept toward the front door. Every step felt amplified, my heart hammering in my chest. I aimed the light outside, sweeping across the clearing. Nothing. No movement. Just shadows dancing in the corners of my vision. Shapes forming and dissolving in the dim morning light. I told myself to calm down, that it was probably a raccoon or some other animal. But the sound I had heard wasn't random. It had intent. It had purpose. My mind kept circling, imagining what it could be. Person? A hunter? Someone who had followed me here? I felt trapped, my safe haven shrinking with every imagined possibility. I never expected a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods to turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had been driving for hours on a lonely, winding road that cut through dense forests, far from any town or city. My plan was simple. Escape the noise of my small apartment, the constant hum of traffic, and the endless chatter of coworkers. I wanted to be alone with nature, even if it meant isolation, and the small wooden cabin I had rented seemed perfect. It was advertised as secluded, quiet, and surrounded by forest. Exactly what I wanted. At first, the isolation felt freeing, a welcome break from everything. But soon, that freedom started to feel like a trap. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace in the corner, a lofted bedroom, and a tiny kitchen with only the essentials. There was a single, narrow dirt road leading up to it, and it had rained a little the day before, leaving the path soft and slippery. I had parked my car just outside, unpacked my things, and wandered around the property. Trees surrounded the cabin on all sides, so close that the sunlight barely touched the ground. Birds were few, and the usual sounds of forest life seemed muted. At first, I told myself that was normal for this part of the woods. It was just a quiet forest. But as I explored, I noticed strange details. The underbrush was trampled in uneven patches, like something had been walking through the trees recently. Branches snapped underfoot, even though I didn't remember stepping on them, and the occasional rustle of movement made me tense up. I shook my head, telling myself it was just small animals, maybe deer or foxes. Inside the cabin, I set up the basics, stacked firewood near the fireplace, checked that the stove worked, and unpacked some groceries. I had no phone signal, which was part of the appeal, but now it was also a source of unease. If anything went wrong, I would be completely cut off. I tried to ignore it. I built a small fire in the fireplace to warm up the room, and as the flames crackled, I felt a strange comfort. The woods were silent outside, but inside, the cabin smelled of burning wood and pine. That night, I went to bed early, lulled by the warmth and quiet, but I couldn't shake a feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, I woke to a noise outside the cabin. First, I thought it was the wind. The trees groaned under the weight of their wet branches, and rain had started to tap against the roof. But then I heard it more clearly, a crunching, slow and deliberate, like footsteps on the damp earth outside. My heart started to race. I lay still, listening. The sound stopped for a moment, then began again, closer this time. I could hear it circling the cabin, slow, careful steps on the forest floor. I told myself it was an animal, a bear maybe, or a deer moving through the underbrush. But the steps felt too precise, too heavy for any deer. And they weren't random. It felt like someone was walking around the cabin, deliberately watching. I got out of bed slowly, careful not to make a sound. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight I had brought for emergencies and crept to the window. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the thick shadows of the forest, but I saw nothing. Nothing moved in the trees, no shining eyes, no figure. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I could hear it again, the crunch of footsteps, this time in a rhythm that seemed almost too intentional. I backed away from the window, telling myself to calm down, that it was probably just my imagination. But sleep didn't come again that night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle outside, made me jump, my body tense and ready. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin to reassure myself. The sun was higher, and the forest seemed less threatening in daylight. though still quiet. I walked along a narrow trail that led down a slope, examining the ground. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were large and human, not the neat prints of a hiker, but uneven, like someone was moving cautiously, trying not to be seen. I followed them for a few hundred meters, but the trail disappeared into dense underbrush. My stomach sank. Whoever had been outside last night was still around here. I hurried back to the cabin, making a mental note to keep the doors locked. Inside, I checked every door and window. They were all secure, but as I stacked firewood near the back door, I noticed a subtle shift in the ground, a disturbed patch of earth that wasn't there before. It looked like someone had tried to dig something, or maybe cover something up. I froze, heart pounding. I wanted to call someone, but my phone had no signal. Panic rose in my chest. I realized that for the first time, I was completely alone in a place where someone could have been watching me without my knowledge. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I cleaned the cabin, organized supplies, and even made a small fire in the fireplace. The warmth helped, but the feeling of being watched never left. I started checking the windows every few minutes, peering out into the forest, looking for movement. As evening approached, I considered leaving, but the dirt road leading out of the cabin had become muddy from rain, and I worried that my car could get stuck in the mud in the dark. I decided to stay, though my nerves were frayed. Then I saw it, a small indentation in the soil that didn't look natural. At first, I thought it might be an animal burrow, but the size and the shape suggested otherwise. Footprint. I crouched and examined it, feeling a jolt of adrenaline. It was too large for any deer or bear I had seen here before. The shape of the sole, the tread, suggested human. Someone had been here recently. My first thought was that it was from a hunter or a hiker, but the deeper I looked, the more irregular the prints became. They weren't following the trail. They were moving toward the cabin. Panic began to rise in my chest. I thought about returning to the cabin, locking the doors, maybe even driving back immediately. But curiosity, or perhaps stubbornness, kept me moving. I followed the prints. They led through dense undergrowth, weaving in a way that suggested someone was deliberately avoiding being seen. My heart pounded, my palms sweaty, and every crack of a branch under my boots made me flinch. Eventually, the prints ended abruptly near a fallen log. I looked around, the forest silent except for the breeze. My mind raced. Someone had been here, close to the cabin, possibly watching me sleep, but there was no sign of them now. I hurried back to the cabin, every sense on alert. When I arrived, I stopped short. The front door, which I had left slightly ajar, was now closed. I hadn't heard it move. My stomach dropped. I approached slowly, heart hammering, and tried the handle. Locked. The lock was old, rusty, and I was sure I hadn't secured it before leaving. That meant someone had been inside. I circled the cabin, checking windows. Nothing appeared broken, but the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. Someone had built a small fire inside the stove just as I had. Whoever it was, they had been here recently. I had a decision to make. Call for help?
Impossible.
No signal. Confront the intruder? Dangerous. Wait, terrifying. I decided to leave immediately, grabbing my bag and running to the car. As I ran, I heard a rustle behind me, quick and deliberate, but when I glanced back, there was nothing. My car was still there, engine cold. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the ignition. I drove fast, the gravel path shaking the car violently, my eyes darting to every shadow. The forest seemed alive around me, each bend of the road a potential hiding spot. I forced myself to focus on the path, counting miles until I reached the main road. Hours later, exhausted and shaking, I reached a small town. I stopped at a gas station, relief washing over me when I saw other people, lights, and cars. I called the police, explaining what happened. They took notes and warned me that in such remote areas, it was difficult to track trespassers. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even back home. I learned later that a man had been arrested in a nearby forest for breaking into cabins and following travelers. He had a record, and evidence suggested he had been hiding out near the same area I had visited. The police told me I was lucky. If I had stayed another night, things could have been much worse. I went back to the woods months later, but not to the cabin. I stayed on marked trails during daylight, among other hikers. The peace I had once sought replaced by a wariness I would never forget. The forest still smelled of pine and earth, still seemed beautiful, but it carried a hidden danger, a reminder that even in isolation, human threats could be more terrifying than any imagined ghost. I never returned to that cabin again. It remained empty, tucked away in the trees. A silent witness to the night, I realized how thin the line between solitude and vulnerability truly is. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The city had worn me down in ways I didn't even realize. The constant noise, the endless movement, the feeling of being trapped in walls that weren't mine. When I first saw the cabin online, isolated in the middle of the mountains, surrounded by dense forest, I thought it would be the perfect escape. It was small, rustic, not fancy, but it had a warmth to it, a promise of quiet that I craved. The photos showed a rough wooden exterior, a small porch with a rocking chair, and smoke curling from the chimney. No internet, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, the forest, and the quiet. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The roads narrowed, twisting through pine forests that blocked out the sun, and the GPS kept losing signal. At some point, I realized I was following little more than a worn path, dirt and gravel that had been carved through the wilderness decades ago. As I rounded the last bend, the cabin came into view, tucked into a clearing that opened like a secret in the trees. It was exactly as the photos had promised, and for a moment, I felt my chest lighten. The air was different here, cleaner, sharper, scented with pine and wet earth, and I breathed it in, hoping it would wash away the months of city life. The cabin itself was small, perhaps 2 rooms at most. The walls were made of heavy logs, rough but sturdy, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. I pulled up the creaking steps to the porch and pushed open the door. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and faint smoke. Dust covered the corners, but it felt solid, real. The small living area had a fireplace, a worn sofa, and a tiny kitchenette, nothing more. There was a loft above, accessible by a steep ladder, which served as a bedroom. I set my bags down and immediately began checking things. The fireplace worked. There was a stack of wood neatly piled next to it. The stove appeared functional, though I didn't plan to cook much. I went outside, looking over the clearing. The forest surrounded the cabin on all sides, thick and dark, and I could hear the distant sound of a stream somewhere downhill. Birds called in the trees, but there was something else too. A constant, low hum of movement from the woods, subtle, almost too soft to place. I shrugged it off as the wind, telling myself I was just imagining things. Night fell faster than I expected. The sun disappeared behind the trees, leaving the clearing in shadow. I lit the fireplace, the smell of burning wood filling the cabin, and I sat back on the sofa, feeling the warmth seep into me. Outside, the forest darkened, the shapes of the trees stretching like black fingers. I thought I could hear snapping twigs, faint rustling, but I told myself it was just animals. Deer, raccoons, foxes, normal forest sounds. I forced my mind back to the fire and the quiet. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach drop. It was coming from outside, slow, deliberate. Footsteps. They weren't fast, like an animal running, but measured, heavy in the snowless forest floor. I froze, listening. They moved closer, pausing as if the person, or whatever it was considering something. My heart hammered in my chest. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a hiker who had gotten lost, maybe someone checking the cabin, maybe nothing. But the steps didn't stop. They circled the cabin, brushing against the trees, stopping near the porch. I moved silently to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. It was small, a paring knife, but better than nothing. I went to the door, pressed my ear against it. The steps were gone. I held my breath for what felt like forever. When nothing happened, I closed the door slowly, locked it, and sat down against the wall, gripping the knife. My mind raced, imagining someone watching from the trees, waiting. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a local had a cabin nearby and was checking the perimeter. Maybe it was a hunter. But deep down, I knew none of that made me feel any safer. Sleep came in fits, shallow and restless. Every sound, every snap of a branch, made me sit up, listening. In the morning, I decided to go explore the area. I needed to see what I was dealing with. The clearing stretched a little downhill, ending in thick woods. I followed a narrow path, the kind that animals made, and eventually found the stream I had heard. It was clear, icy, and fast-moving. The area looked undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Everywhere I looked, the forest seemed to press in, dense and silent, with shadows lingering unnaturally. By the second night, the sense of being watched intensified. I tried to keep busy, chopping wood, cleaning the cabin, exploring nearby trails, but the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't outside. I heard something scratching, maybe even sliding along the walls, faint but distinct. I checked the windows. Nothing. The doors were locked. My mind began to play tricks on me, turning the ordinary noises of the forest into threats. I started setting chairs against the doors, wedging logs behind them, trying to feel secure. That night, the footsteps returned. Louder this time. I could hear them circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. My mind raced, thinking of what I should do. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, clutching it tightly. The sound of movement paused. Then, from the back of the cabin, I heard something else. A scraping like metal against wood. My heart froze. Someone had been trying to open the back door. I held my breath, waiting. After a few tense moments, the sound stopped. I didn't dare move. I stayed crouched near the fireplace, listening, feeling every nerve in my body screaming in panic. The footsteps slowly retreated, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided I had to leave, no matter the mud or risk. I packed my car quickly, throwing in everything I had brought, even the supplies I hadn't used. As I walked out to the road, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Near the edge of the trees, just beyond the clearing around the cabin, I saw a figure. It was far enough that I couldn't make out details, but it was human, standing perfectly still, watching me. My hands shook, but I kept walking, keeping my eyes on the road. The figure didn't move, didn't approach, just watched. I got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The figure was still standing there, in the clearing, silent, unmoving. The forest swallowed it as I drove further down the road, but the sense of dread stayed with me. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was shaking, my hands white on the steering wheel. I pulled into a gas station, my hands trembling as I called the local sheriff. I explained the situation, though I didn't know what details would make sense. They took a report, sent a patrol car to check the area, but nothing had been found. No footprints, no disturbed ground, no sign of anyone having been near the cabin. It took weeks before I felt even remotely safe. I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps at night, the scraping sound at the back door, or the figure watching me as I drove away. I learned later that the cabin I rented had been broken into in the past, sometimes used by squatters or criminals to hide out temporarily. The owners had never mentioned it in the listing. The isolation that had seemed so appealing suddenly felt like a trap. In the end, I decided never to return to that area. I sold the cabin reservation, switched to more populated retreats for future trips, and started taking basic self-defense courses. I realized that the real danger wasn't supernatural, wasn't a ghost or a monster from a fairy tale. It was human, and human fear is far more unpredictable and terrifying. The experience stayed with me for years. Every time I hear footsteps behind me on a quiet street or rustling in the woods during a hike, I remember that night. I learned to trust my instincts, to respect isolation, and never to underestimate the presence of others, even when the forest seems empty. What I experienced was real, human, and dangerous, and knowing that it could happen again changed the way I approached every quiet place. every remote cabin, every moment of solitude. I never thought a weekend getaway could feel so threatening, but it did. And that memory, every detail of it, stays with me, etched into my mind like a warning I can never forget. The next day, I made the decision to leave. The unease had turned into a gnawing fear that didn't go away, no matter how much I distracted myself. I packed my things, ready to drive back to the nearest town. But as I loaded the car, I realized the tires were flat. Both of them. I hadn't noticed them the day before because the gravel had covered the wear, but now, flat as pancakes, making any escape impossible. My stomach dropped. I tried using the spare, but it was old, worn, and one of the bolts was stripped. I was stuck. The cabin, once a peaceful retreat, now felt like a trap. My sense of isolation shifted into a sense of being watched, of being closed in, like the forest itself was pressing against me. I spent the day trying to fix the tires, moving rocks, using makeshift tools, anything I could find. But nothing worked. I tried using my phone to call for help, only to find no signal. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. I was alone with no easy way out, in the middle of a forest I barely knew. The sun sank low in the sky, and the shadows grew long. I went inside the cabin, barricaded the doors as best I could, and tried to make myself a meal. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a creeping panic I couldn't shake. I stayed awake most of the night, listening, waiting, jumping at every sound. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, felt like it was aimed at me. The following day, I explored more of the surrounding area, trying to find a road, a trail, any sign of civilization. The forest seemed endless, and every path I took looped back to the same clearing. I realized I had underestimated how isolated this place truly was. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, exhausted and covered in scratches from brambles and thorns. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, the weight of fear pressing down. I knew I had to stay calm, conserve my energy, and think logically. I spent hours checking the doors, windows, and locks, making sure nothing could surprise me inside. The outside remained unpredictable, threatening, and silent most of the time, except for those occasional sounds that reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. As night fell again, the fear reached a new intensity. I kept the fire burning, using every log I could find, and I sat in the corner, back against the wall, flashlight in hand. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and doors, and I could hear faint, distant sounds. Footsteps, dragging, whispering, almost carried by the wind. I stayed still, not daring to move. Every hour felt like a day. By the time dawn arrived, I felt physically and mentally drained. I had survived 2 nights of near paranoia, but it was clear that staying any longer without help or a way out could break me completely. On the 3rd morning, I had an idea. I noticed a small creek not far from the cabin the day before. Following water might lead to a larger body, a road, or signs of human presence. I packed lightly, leaving food and supplies behind, and started walking along the creek. The forest was dense, but the sound of flowing water guided me. Hours passed, and I kept a steady pace, trying not to focus on the fear, but rather on survival. My body ached, my legs burned, and every shadow seemed to move, but I pressed on. As the afternoon approached, I finally heard something that made my heart leap, the faint hum of an engine. Following the sound, I came across a narrow dirt road and, in the distance, a truck approaching. I waved frantically, relief washing over me like a tidal wave. The driver stopped, a man in his 40s, who looked concerned when I explained my situation. He agreed to give me a ride to the nearest town, and as I left the forest behind, I glanced back at the cabin, small and isolated, almost forgotten among the trees. It had been a beautiful place in the light of day, but at night, with no one around, it became a trap, a place that magnified fear in every sound, every shadow. I learned that isolation could be beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. By the time I reached the town, I was exhausted but safe, filled with a deep appreciation for human connection and the mundane comfort of being somewhere with other people, where nothing moved in the shadows, and every sound was familiar. I never returned to that cabin. The fear I had experienced there stayed with me for months, a reminder that the wilderness, while stunning and serene, could also be unforgiving and isolating. But I also carried with me a sense of resilience, knowing I had survived something terrifying on my own, that I had navigated fear and isolation and come out the other side. In the end, the cabin had given me more than just a retreat. It had given me a test of endurance, courage, and the raw truth of what it meant to face solitude.